Chapter 117. However, when Zhang Xiaohua finished reading those books, she discovered that these books seemed to be too basic. She had a feeling that they were not enough to quench her thirst. If she wanted to use the things she learned from these books to solve the problem of medicinal herbs not germinating, it would be wishful thinking. Helpless, Zhang Xiaohua could only throw these books on the Kong bed. When she was bored, she would flip through them again. Without new books to read, Zhang Xiaohua once again lived a monotonous life of working and cultivating. Although reading books was a good habit, Zhang Xiaohua would never buy books for the sake of reading. Books could not be read unless they were borrowed. Zhang Xiaohua felt the same way in her heart. On the other hand, He Tianshu was used to seeing Zhang Xiaohua running around with books. Not long after, he discovered Zhang Xiaohua's abnormality. He asked with interest, thinking that Zhang Xiaohua had given up on her research. However, when he heard Zhang Xiaohua's reason, he didn't believe it at first. However, when he thought about how this person in front of him used Shuo Wen Jiezi to enlighten her, his brows relaxed. He snapped his right hand and said, "Isn't that easy?" Then he muttered in Nie Xiao Er's ear for a moment. Nie Xiao Er listened while sizing up Zhang Xiaohua from the corner of his eyes, making Zhang Xiaohua's hair stand on end. What was he doing? After he finished muttering, Nie Xiao Er left to carry out his orders. He Tianshu beamed at Zhang Xiaohua and said, "All right, you wait. I'll show you my methods in a while." Zhang Xiaohua rolled her eyes and curled her lips, saying, "What methods are you playing? Making it so mysterious. I'll just wait." This Nie Xiao Er left for half a day. He only returned to the small courtyard empty-handed in the evening. Seeing Nie Xiao Er return empty-handed, He Tianshu was very shocked and asked, "You didn't do it?" Nie Xiao Er said, "Elder, he said that our hall's books are only for the disciples to read. They cannot be borrowed from outsiders." He Tianshu frowned. "You didn't look for hall master Bai?" Nie Xiao Er smiled bitterly and said, "I did, but hall master Bai didn't pay much attention to me. He only said that you're trying to find any doctor when you're seriously ill. How can a child without any foundation solve the problem by just reading books? He told you to think of another way. He also told me to tell you that he's also discussing this problem with the elders in the hall. He told you not to mess around." He Tianshu's face alternated between red and green as he looked into Zhang Xiaohua's eyes. He felt very embarrassed, but he seemed to have thought of something. His face relaxed as he said, "Zhang Xiaohua, go back to your room first. I'll bring you those books in a while." Zhang Xiaohua looked at him curiously, nodded in agreement, and went straight back into the house. Since someone wanted to find books for him to read, of course he wouldn't refuse. Sure enough, not long after, He Tianshu came back with a grin on his face carrying a pile of books. He piled them on Zhang Xiaohua's Kong. He clapped his hands and said, "All right, Zhang Xiaohua, I finally found the books for you. Read them well." Zhang Xiaohua looked at the pile of books on her Kong in surprise and asked curiously, "So many? Where did Captain He get them?" He Tianshu pretended to be mysterious. "Look at how powerful his methods are. How can such a small problem not be solved? He, read carefully. Zhang Xiaohua, don't mind our hall master's words. I still say the same thing. It's best if it can be solved, but it's fine if it can't be solved. Just treat it as you reading books to broaden your horizons." Also, He Tianshu muttered to himself, "The Jianghu is dangerous. What can a child like you rely on? Learn more, and you'll be able to live a good life." Zhang Xiaohua finally understood He Tianshu's painstaking efforts. She couldn't help but feel grateful. Humans weren't plants. How could they be emotionless? She and He Tianshu were neither relatives nor friends. Just living together for a short period of time, he took care of her in every possible way. Not only did he teach her fist techniques, he even pointed out the path for her future. It could be seen that this dangerous Jianghu wasn't just filled with traps and arrows. There was also warmth and care. Zhang Xiaohua smiled and said, "I understand, Captain He. I won't let you down. At least I have to learn more, right?" He Tianshu nodded. "It's good that you understand. Read your books yourself. I'm leaving." After saying that, he smiled and walked out. Zhang Xiaohua sent him to the door. When he left the house, she was about to turn around when she saw He Tianshu turn his head and say, "Oh right, Zhang Xiaohua, I almost forgot. How's your practice of fist techniques?" We haven't practiced together in a long time. Zhang Xiaohua said with a smile, "It's all right, Captain He. I mixed the fist techniques you taught me and some of the fist techniques my second brother taught me together. I can practice them too." He Tianshu smiled and said, "Not bad, Zhang Xiaohua. You know how to create your own techniques. You're promising. Practice well. When you have the chance, let me see it." Zhang Xiaohua smiled and said, "Okay, no problem, Captain He. I can do it any time." He Tianshu said, "You won't forget this time?" Zhang Xiaohua said, "I won't. Don't worry." He Tianshu said, "Okay then. When I have the time, I'll see it. You read your books too. I'm leaving." After saying that, he walked out of the house. Zhang Xiaohua saw him leave and was about to turn around when He Tianshu turned his head again and said, "Oh, I almost forgot. Zhang Xiaohua." Zhang Xiaohua was stunned. She turned around again and said, "What is it, Captain He?" He Tianshu said, "I borrowed the book from the village head. When she heard that you were reading it, she was very happy. She said that when you're done, she has more. You can go and get it. You can ask Xiaotong for it." When Zhang Xiaohua heard this, she was very happy and said, "Really? That's great. Thank you, Captain He." He Tianshu smiled and said, "What are you thanking me for? Okay, go and read your books." After saying that, he walked out of the house. Zhang Xiaohua watched him leave. This time, she didn't turn around and waited quietly. He Tianshu was about to leave when he remembered something. He turned around and said, "Oh, I almost forgot. Zhang Xiaohua." When he saw that Zhang Xiaohua was still standing there and looking at him with a smile and didn't turn around, he was stunned and said, "Zhang Xiaohua, why aren't you reading?" Zhang Xiaohua smiled and said, "I'm waiting for Captain He to tell me about I almost forgot again." He Tianshu smiled and said, "I see. It's like this, then." His expression became very strange. Zhang Xiaohua frowned and said, "What's wrong?" He Tianshu pursed his lips and said, "I really forgot this time. Forget it, I won't talk about it. I'll tell you when I remember." After saying that, he turned around and walked out of the house. Zhang Xiaohua didn't move. She quietly waited for He Tianshu to leave. Then, she stuck her head out and watched as He Tianshu walked away and patted his forehead. When he entered his room, Zhang Xiaohua felt relieved. She closed the door and went to read on the Kong bed. He Tianshu entered the room. He was still thinking about what he wanted to say just now. He Tianshu kept tossing and turning in bed until it was very late at night. He Tianshu frowned and thought until a ray of light appeared on the horizon. He Tianshu suddenly sat up and laughed. "I finally remembered. I want to tell Zhang Xiaohua not to read too late and to pay attention to rest." With the new program, Zhang Xiaohua was naturally happy and forgot about home. Every day, he read and practiced martial arts. He only hoped that these days would last. However, the more he read, the more he felt that the cultivation of medicinal herbs was complicated and profound. He really admired someone who could write so many things. At the same time, he was very grateful to Li Jinfeng for teaching him how to read. He was also very grateful to Huanqi Manor for giving him the opportunity to read. He was very grateful to the Manor Lord for lending these books to him. Finally, he also wanted to thank his parents for letting him out. Well, if he put his parents last, no one would say anything. By the way, when he saw the Manor Lord one day, should he mention to her to find a job for his parents? The more he knew, the more he didn't know. Zhang Xiaohua was now in this state. As He Tianshu brought those books to read, Zhang Xiaohua felt more and more that he knew too little. In fact, he had forgotten his main purpose. He had forgotten to find the reason why those seeds didn't germinate. He actually agreed with the pharmacy hall master's words. It was impossible to solve the problem that He Tianshu and the others encountered by simply reading a few books. In fact, if it could be solved by just reading books, then the pharmacy hall elder would have done it long ago. However, Zhang Xiaohua was already infatuated with this magical world of medicinal herbs. In the afternoon, Zhang Xiaohua returned to the house after practicing the fist technique. As usual, he picked up more books and prepared more. Only then did he remember that he had finished reading all the books last night. Zhang Xiaohua flipped through the books and felt very bored. Zhang Xiaohua had a bad habit of reading books. He didn't like to read a book a second time after reading it. Although He Tianshu brought over a lot of books, it couldn't stop Zhang Xiaohua from reading them day and night. Suddenly, Zhang Xiaohua remembered that when He Tianshu brought the books over, he said that if he finished reading all these books, he could go to the manor lord to borrow more. He could also find Qiu Tong. Thinking that he hadn't seen elder sister Qiu Tong for a long time, he wanted to take this opportunity to see her. After making up his mind, Zhang Xiaohua carried the books and went to look for He Tianshu. The door to He Tianshu's house was tightly shut. Zhang Xiaohua shouted outside for a long time, but no one answered. He must have gone out. This made Zhang Xiaohua worried. He had never entered the inner manor. He didn't know where elder sister Qiu Tong was, let alone the manor lord. Just as he was about to return to his house, Zhang Xiaohua remembered that he had looked for Elder Yu last time. Elder Yu definitely knew about it. He carried the books and entered through the small round door, walking towards the inner courtyard. After passing through a few courtyards, he arrived at Elder Yu's residence. Unfortunately, Elder Yu wasn't there either. Zhang Xiaohua felt discouraged. What day was it today? He didn't look at the almanac. Everything was going wrong? However, since he had already entered, he might as well continue to look around. If he saw one or two people, he could ask. He was also a member of the Misty Mountain Villa, so he wasn't afraid of being misunderstood. However, he forgot that the people in green clothes and hats and the few people from the medicine hall rarely entered the inner courtyard. That was where the girls lived. Just as Zhang Xiaohua was about to barge in, he suddenly heard someone scream. Where did this child come from? Why are you here? Zhang Xiaohua froze and couldn't help but stop in his tracks. Could they be talking about him? When he turned to look, there was indeed a girl standing under the shed in the small courtyard. She had washed clothes and was about to dry them. Zhang Xiaohua hurriedly bowed and said, I'm Captain He Tianshu's subordinate from the medicine fields outside. I want to come in to look for elder sister Qiu Tong. When the girl heard this, she looked puzzled. She put down the clothes and walked over. She looked Zhang Xiaohua up and down and said, Captain He's subordinate? Why haven't I heard of you before? You're so young. How did you come out of the medicine hall? Zhang Xiaohua naturally knew that she had misunderstood him as someone from the Misty School. It wasn't easy for him to explain, so he said, I just came here not long ago. I'm not from the medicine hall, so elder sister probably doesn't know me. You just have to look for elder sister Qiu Tong, and you'll naturally know. The girl felt that it made sense and said, Since you're new here, you might not know the rules of the villa. You can't trespass into the inner courtyard without orders. Seeing that you're still young, Captain, he must have been careless. You mustn't do this again. If the villa head finds out, you'll be caned. Zhang Xiaohua was shocked. He stuck out his tongue and said, It's that serious. I really didn't know. However, he cursed inwardly. Seriously, Captain He. Why didn't he tell me in detail and made me look for the villa head myself? The feeling of being caned on the butt is probably not good. Why didn't Tian Zhongxi say anything? How strange. Actually, this was also a misunderstanding. Tian Zhongxi and He Tianshu knew that he was someone brought in by Qiu Tong and thought that Qiu Tong had already explained the rules of the villa to him. Qiu Tong also saw him as her younger brother and naturally felt that there was nothing to hide. Moreover, after bringing Zhang Xiaohua in, they originally wanted to give her some instructions. However, they were stopped by the villa head's words of, work on your own, and had long forgotten about it. What was even more amazing was that Zhang Xiaohua had been recuperating in the escort agency for several months. In everyone's eyes, he was already an old person. In fact, he was still very fresh. However, he was indeed young and the girl didn't mind. She said, Don't go in any further. I'll help you look for Qiu Tong. Then, she quickly walked in. Zhang Xiaohua could only wait there and look curiously at the small courtyard. This courtyard was slightly smaller than the one Zhang Xiaohua and the others were staying in. However, it was unusually clean, and there were even some flowers and plants planted in the corners. It was easy for Zhang Xiaohua to think of his sister-in-law. Didn't Lu Qian like to plant flowers and plants in the courtyard? When he saw the clothes that the girl was about to dry, he lowered his head and thought for a moment. Then, he walked forward and placed the books he was carrying on the stone table. He washed his hands with the clean water in the basin and helped to dry the clothes in the basin one by one. Zhang Xiaohua used to help his mother do these things when he was at home. Naturally, He was familiar with the process and finished it in a short while. Moreover, when he was drying the clothes, he couldn't help but think about his family. Then, Zhang Xiaohua hugged the books and waited at the door. He felt very strange. Although he often missed home, it wasn't as frequent when he was in the medicinal field. He had only entered the inner courtyard for a short while, but if he wasn't missing his parents, then he was missing his sister-in-law. What was going on? Just as he was thinking, Zhang Xiaohua felt someone walking over from afar. Although he didn't hear the footsteps, Zhang Xiaohua could clearly feel it. As expected, the girl soon led Xiao Tong over. Xiao Tong saw Zhang Xiaohua from afar and said happily, "It really is you, Zhang Xiaohua." Xiao Ju said that a child was looking for you, but she couldn't say the name. "I guessed it was you." Seeing Xiao Ju's flushed face, Zhang Xiaohua was speechless. This girl was really careless. She didn't even ask for his name before running in. He could only say, "Big sister Xiao Ju ran too fast. I forgot to tell her." Xiao Tong smiled and said, "Xiaohua is a sensible child. She knows how to cover for others." However, everyone in the village knows about Xiao Ju's carelessness. "All right, come in with me. Why did you suddenly come to find me today?" After speaking, she led Zhang Xiaohua inside. As Xiao Ju watched the two of them walk away, the blush on her face faded away. She secretly scolded herself for being careless. However, when she lifted her leg to continue with her work, she saw the clothes that were being hung out to dry. Her face turned even redder. This little brat was rather diligent and knew how to help others. However, how could a girl's clothes be hung out to dry by a man? The sudden change was that of a teenage boy. Xiao Ju stood in the courtyard. She didn't know if she should take down some of the clothes and wash them again. Endless confusion. Meanwhile, Zhang Xiaohua, who was walking into the inner courtyard, didn't know that her good deed had turned into a bad one. She happily told Xiao Tong the reason for her visit. When Xiao Tong heard that Zhang Xiaohua was reading a book about medicinal herbs, she was very happy. She couldn't help but rub Zhang Xiaohua's head like a little brother. She smiled and said, "Xiaohua, you're really amazing. When you first arrived, you didn't even know how to read. Now, you can actually read. If you can really help the village head solve the problem of the seeds, that would be great." Zhang Xiaohua said seriously, "Big sister Xiao Tong, I can read thanks to that young masterly you met last time." "Oh, right. He came to our village with my second brother last time. He even said that he wanted to meet you." Xiao Tong was stunned. She immediately understood and said with a smile, "Did young masterly tell you to say that?" Zhang Xiaohua quickly explained, "I wanted to tell you that, but young masterly didn't let me. He just told me to mention him casually. Why don't you ask him the next time he comes?" Xiao Tong smiled and said, "We'll talk about it later. Right now, it's better to help the village head solve the problem." Zhang Xiaohua quickly said, "Young masterly also gave me a few books like this at the beginning." However, seeing that Xiao Tong didn't seem to want to talk about this, she quickly added, "However, I think that just reading these books and only studying the theory isn't enough. It's best to combine it with practice. This theory comes from practice, but it's better than practice. Experts record their practice into books for us to study. After we finish learning, we still have to return to practice. Only then can we truly test the theory and turn it into our own knowledge. This is true knowledge from practice." When Xiao Tong heard this, she couldn't help but stop and say, "Who told you this?" When Zhang Xiaohua saw that Xiao Tong had stopped, she also stopped and said, "I learned all of this from reading these books. Am I wrong?" Xiao Tong smiled and said, "You're not wrong. It seems that the village head often says these things. I thought that someone else told you. All right, let's go." The village head and the others seemed to have something to do in the hall. "I'll help you find the books. Please bookmark it, thank you." 0. Chapter 118. However, Xiao Tong changed her mind after walking a short distance with Zhang Xiaohua. Oyin had not told Xiao Tong what books she was going to give to Zhang Xiaohua. Moreover, it was inappropriate to bring someone into the Manor Master's study without the Manor Master's permission. Therefore, Xiao Tong brought Zhang Xiaohua to the main hall. As soon as they got close to the main hall, Zhang Xiaohua heard two people talking inside. One of them had a very pleasant voice, like an oriole flying out of a valley. One would never get tired of listening to it for a long time. The other person's enunciation was smooth and unhurried, but it did not have that kind of charm. Zhang Xiaohua could not help but think that the person with the pleasant voice was the manner master, Yan. In fact, Zhang Xiaohua had already started guessing Yan's appearance and voice when she came to the inner courtyard. She had been at Huanqi Manor for several months, and Yan had treated her very well. However, she had never seen her before. This time, she was here not only to return the books, but also to thank Yan in person for taking care of her. Qiu Tong asked Zhang Xiaohua to wait outside the room while she went in to report. After Qiu Tong entered the main hall, the two people inside stopped talking. Zhang Xiaohua heard Qiu Tong say from inside, "Manor Master, Zhang Xiaohua from the herb field is here to return your books. He wants to borrow some more. What books do you want to borrow from him?" At this moment, Zhang Xiaohua's ears perked up. She wanted to know who the voice was. Unfortunately, to her disappointment, the gentle voice said, He's finished reading so quickly? Could it be that this fellow was just randomly flipping through the books? Let him in. I'll ask him. If he really reads them and understands them, it won't be too late to borrow them then." It turned out that the extremely pleasant voice was not Yan's voice. Qiu Tong came out and gestured for Zhang Xiaohua to enter the room. When Zhang Xiaohua entered the room carefully, she saw a dignified and beautiful woman in her 20s sitting at the front of the hall. Her temperament was similar to Lu Qian's, and her skin was fair and smooth. If it weren't for the fact that the woman in front of her had phoenix eyes and Lu Qian's almond-shaped eyes, Zhang Xiaohua would have called her sister-in-law. On the other side of the hall sat a middle-aged woman with ordinary features. Her skin was dark and coarse, and although her clothes were bright, they couldn't hide her bucket-like waist. Zhang Xiaohua couldn't help but stare blankly for a moment. Could it be that the voice that had been reverberating for 3 days had come from this woman? At this moment, Yan spoke. "Are you Zhang Xiaohua?" Zhang Xiaohua quickly retracted her gaze and bowed deeply. "Yes, Sister Manorhead, I am Zhang Xiaohua." Yan was a little stunned and almost laughed out loud. "Sister? Haha, it's been a long time since someone called me sister. Zhang Xiaohua, your little mouth is really sweet." Zhang Xiaohua didn't think much of it and couldn't help but scratch her head. "Is there a problem?" "Sister Manorhead." Yan didn't get angry and only asked, "Why did you suddenly think of calling me sister?" Zhang Xiaohua said curiously, "Manorhead is older than me, so I have to call you sister. Moreover, Manorhead looks very similar to my sister-in-law. Just now, I almost called her sister-in-law. That's right, my sister-in-law's name is Lu Qian. Before she married my big brother, I called her Sister Lu. So, I feel that Manorhead is very close to me, so of course I should call you sister." The dark and coarse woman next to her spoke. Her clear voice rang in Zhang Xiaohua's ears. "Haha, this Xiaohua is really interesting. It's been a long time since I've seen such a simple child." Zhang Xiaohua looked at the woman and couldn't help but say, "Sister's voice is really nice." Yan smiled and said, "Just call her Sister Qin. If you call her Sister Qin a few more times, she'll talk to you more and let you listen more." The woman turned out to be Aunt Qin from the Misty School's Ming Chui Hall. When Zhang Xiaohua heard this, he obediently said to the woman, "Hello, Sister Qin." Aunt Qin couldn't help but be stunned. She smiled and said, "Everyone calls me Aunt Qin, but you actually called me sister. That's fine. It sounds very comfortable. If you need sister's help in the future, don't hesitate to ask." Yan smiled even more and said, "Zhang Xiaohua, why aren't you thanking Sister Qin? She doesn't open her mouth easily." Zhang Xiaohua was confused. He bowed and said, "Thank you, Sister Qin." Actually, he didn't think much of it in his heart. There was no such thing as a free lunch. It was his first time meeting her, so she definitely wouldn't help him just because of a title. He also didn't know what Yan meant. She was probably joking. Everyone teased and said a few more words. Only then did Yan ask Zhang Xiaohua, "Zhang Xiaohua, have you read these books? Do you understand them?" Zhang Xiaohua honestly said, "I've read them, Manorhead sister." This time, Yan frowned and said, "Big Sister Manor Lord sounds awkward. You can call me Big Sister O or Big Sister Yan." Zhang Xiaohua thought for a moment and said, "I understand, Sister O." However, Yan didn't quite believe Zhang Xiaohua's words and said, "Zhang Xiaohua, the most taboo thing when reading books is not to ask for a thorough understanding. You shouldn't bite off more than you can chew. Last time, I heard from He Tianshu that you've already read a lot of books. This time, you took so many books and finished reading them so quickly. Can you remember and understand them? Zhang Xiaohua was a little anxious and said, Really, Sister O, I understand them all. But because I understood these books, I realized that there are too many things I don't understand. Oyen heard him say this and her expression relaxed and said, If that's the case, I'll ask you a few questions. After saying this, Oyen flipped through the books and picked a few questions for Zhang Xiaohua to answer. In Zhang Xiaohua's eyes, these questions weren't questions at all. They were written clearly in the books, so he answered them fluently without thinking. When Oyen saw that Zhang Xiaohua answered quickly, she was very happy and picked a few questions that weren't in the books for him to answer. This time, Zhang Xiaohua thought for a moment and answered the questions that he thought were appropriate based on the knowledge he had read. Oyen was even more happy when she heard this. After pointing out the inconsistencies in Zhang Xiaohua's answers, she said, Zhang Xiaohua, I didn't expect you to be so proficient in these books. Very good. Wait here, I'll bring out more books for you to read. If there's anything you don't understand, come and ask me. After saying this, she excused herself from Aunt Qin and left with Chiu Tong with a face full of smiles. Only Aunt Qin and Zhang Xiaohua were left in the main hall. When Aunt Qin saw Zhang Xiaohua standing there obediently with his head lowered, she started chatting with him and asked about Zhang Xiaohua's recent situation. Zhang Xiaohua didn't hide anything from this good-natured older sister. He told her about how he came to Pingyang City, how he came to Huanxi Mountain Villa, and how he got injured. He only left out the part about the Fist of the North Star and the sword technique. When Aunt Qin heard about Zhang Xiaohua's encounter, she couldn't help but sigh. She thought about her own childhood and couldn't help but feel closer to Zhang Xiaohua. Just as they were talking, Oyen returned. Behind her, Chiu Tong actually carried a white cloth bag that looked very heavy. Zhang Xiaohua hurriedly ran over to take it. It was heavy in his hands too. He guessed that there were many books inside. Oyen sat down and said, Zhang Xiaohua, these are the books I picked out according to your situation. Read them well. Just now, I heard from Chiu Tong that you actually know how to combine theory with practice. That's really not bad. You have to continue on this path. Go as far as you can. It will be beneficial for both you and the villa. Zhang Xiaohua smiled and said, Okay, Sister O, I will work hard to read and practice. I hope I can help Sister O solve the problem of the seeds. At the mention of the seeds, Oyen couldn't hide the frown on her face. She said, Your hopes are good. However, if I could find the reason just by reading these books, I would have found it long ago. Zhang Xiaohua was a little embarrassed. It seemed like she had made up her mind at the wrong time. She said, As the saying goes, 3 cobblers are better than Zhuge. If we all think of a solution together, there might be hope. Oyen smiled and said, What you said makes sense, but many things can't be solved with more people. We still need senior people to deal with it. Then, Oyen pondered for a moment and said, Zhang Xiaohua, read these books first. After a while, I will take you to see a real expert. You can see how they treat herbs. Hearing this, Chiu Tong's expression changed. She said, Young miss, you've decided to go alone? Aunt Qin also said, Yin you have to think carefully. The journey is long, thousands of miles. Can your body handle it? Oyen smiled and said, Big Sister Qin, you don't have to worry about me. Although the journey is a little long, didn't Chiu Tong go there last time? My body isn't any weaker than Chiu Tong's. Why can't I go? Chiu Tong begged, Young miss, let me go again. You shoulder the fate of the villa. It's better for you to stay in the villa and take care of the situation. Let us do the running. Oyen smiled bitterly and said, A year has passed and there is still no movement from these seeds. This is a huge problem that concerns the strength of the Misty School. That day, I made a promise in front of Big Brother. If I can't solve it, won't I become a sinner in the sect? Aunt Qin also advised, these seeds have been lost for a long time. The specific method of planting them may have been lost long ago. Although you made a promise in front of the sect leader that day, most of them have been planted. Why care about this little bit? Oyen smiled bitterly and said, This little bit is the most important thing. Last time, Chiu Tong went, they closed the door and refused to see us. They must think that we don't care enough. If I don't go, Won't this path be cut off? Seeing that they couldn't persuade Yin, Aunt Qin and Qiu Tong didn't say anything else. Only Zhang Xiaohua listened to the three of them as if she was listening to a book from heaven. She didn't know what they were talking about. It seemed that when she was injured, Qiu Tong said that she went to the south and didn't come to see her. From what she heard, she went to ask someone to solve the problem of the seeds. However, that person felt that Qiu Tong's identity wasn't right and refused to see her. Qiu Tong returned empty-handed. Now, Yin wanted to go personally. From what she heard, she wanted to bring her along. The other two felt that Yin's identity was noble and were afraid that something would happen, so they stopped her. Zhang Xiaohua understood. Seeing that the three of them weren't interested, she quickly thanked Yin for borrowing the book and was about to leave. Yin smiled and said a few more words of encouragement before letting Qiu Tong take her away. Qiu Tong wasn't in a good mood. She brought Zhang Xiaohua to Qiuju's courtyard with a dark expression and said, "Zhang Xiaohua, next time if you want to find me or the manor head, don't rush in rashly. Although you're young, you still have to abide by the manor's rules. If you see Qiuju or anyone else here, let them come in to find me, all right?" Zhang Xiaohua smiled and said, "I know, big sister Qiu Tong. Don't be unhappy. I'm sure there'll be a solution." Qiu Tong forced a smile and said, "I know. Xiaohua, you should work hard too. I hope you can help." Qiu Tong watched as Zhang Xiaohua walked away with a bag of books. Only then did she turn and walk away quickly. Zhang Xiaohua walked back with a large bag of books in her left hand. Luckily, Zhang Xiaohua had the strength of 250 kilograms in one arm. That was why she seemed so light. If it were anyone else, it would be difficult. She didn't know how Qiu Tong had carried the books from the study to the living room. When Zhang Xiaohua returned to the room, she threw the bag on the Kong bed and drank some water. When she opened it, her eyes widened involuntarily. My goodness, there really are a lot of books. There are at least a few dozen books. No wonder it's so heavy. However, Zhang Xiaohua was immediately overjoyed. With so many books, she would have something to rely on for the long night. At night, when Zhang Xiaohua finished practicing martial arts and casually opened a book, she suddenly realized that it was different from the previous books. First of all, the previous books were more basic, but these new books were obviously more profound. It was just right for Zhang Xiaohua's current level. Just a casual glance was enough to tickle Zhang Xiaohua's heart. She couldn't bear to let go of them. Secondly, the blank spaces of the previous books were as clean as before. However, these new books had more or less fine writing in the blank spaces of every page. There were only a few words in a few places, but there were many densely packed words that filled the entire page. When Zhang Xiaohua squinted her eyes to take a closer look, she realized that these words were written about the insights and experiences of reading this page. This was the first time that Zhang Xiaohua had encountered such a way of reading. Her eyes lit up and she began to read carefully. The more Zhang Xiaohua read, the more shocked she was, and the more she admired the person who wrote this. The notes in the blank spaces not only highlighted the main points of the page, but also quoted from classics and wrote a lot of things by analogy. It was enough to show that the reader's knowledge was profound. As she read, Zhang Xiaohua suddenly thought of something. She put down the book in her hand, picked up another book from the Kong, and opened it. Sure enough, that book was also densely packed with notes. Then, Zhang Xiaohua casually picked up a few more books, and they were all the same. Zhang Xiaohua suddenly realized that such beautiful handwriting belonged to none other than the manor lord, Yin. Looking at such a large pile of books, Zhang Xiaohua was actually able to read them in such detail. Zhang Xiaohua felt admiration from the bottom of her heart. Also, she was filled with gratitude. This sister manor lord really treated her as an outsider and generously lent her the books that she usually read. At this moment, Zhang Xiaohua really put Sister O on the same level as her sister-in-law. With enough books to read, Zhang Xiaohua's life became rich. She worked in the herbal field, practiced martial arts in the forest, and read books under the light. With these three activities, Zhang Xiaohua was not lonely at all. However, in her free time, Zhang Xiaohua was also looking forward to a long journey. Previously, Sister Qiu Tong went on a long journey for a few months. She said that she was going to the south, and she really wanted to go out and take a look. The furthest she had ever been to in her life was Pingyang City, and it was only a few days' journey. From the books, the climate and living habits of the South were very different from Pingyang City. Moreover, many of the medicinal herbs were different from Pingyang City as well. If she could go and take a look personally, it would definitely be better than just reading books. Scholars often said that reading 10,000 books was equivalent to traveling 10,000 miles. Even Zhang Xiaohua now had this kind of pursuit. Scrolls were really good things to cultivate people's minds. However, the long journey did not come quickly because of Zhang Xiaohua's longing. After a few days, there was no news from anyone. Gradually, Zhang Xiaohua stopped thinking about it. One day, Zhang Xiaohua was working in the fields as usual when she saw He Tianchu bringing a few people over. The two people in front were old men with white hair and beards. Behind them were a few slightly younger people. Some of them looked gentle, while others looked strong and powerful. However, their attitude was the same as He Tianchu's. They were all very respectful to the two people. Zhang Xiaohua sighed. She had never seen team leader He like this before. These two people must be the higher-ups of the pharmacy hall. Anyway, she was not from the Misty school and did not need to be so respectful to them. Therefore, Zhang Xiaohua lowered her body and carefully moved the soil and weeded the grass. She carefully looked at each herb and observed their condition. Unfortunately, things did not go as she wished. He Tianchu saw her from afar and did not intend to let her go. He was leading the group of people over. When they got closer, He Tianchu called out, "Zhang Xiaohua, come over here for a while." Zhang Xiaohua looked up helplessly. She picked up the hoe and walked over. Seeing Zhang Xiaohua approaching, He Tianchu said to her, "Zhang Xiaohua, quickly come and greet Hall Master Bai and Elder He from the pharmacy hall." Zhang Xiaohua hurriedly bowed deeply and said, "Greetings, Hall Master Bai, Elder He." He Tianchu smiled obsequiously and said to the purple-faced old man, "Hall Master Bai, this is Zhang Xiaohua that I mentioned to you before. She is very practical and capable. She is also extremely smart and has already read many books about medicinal herbs." The two people did not return the greeting. Only Hall Master Bai waved his hand slightly. Elder He nodded in agreement and did not say anything. He Tianchu still said somewhat tactfully, "Hall Master Bai, you see, Zhang Xiaohua is very eager to learn. There are many books in our pharmacy. Do you think you can lend one or two to her to broaden her horizons? After all, she also works in the medicine field. It is always good to learn more." Before Hall Master Bai could say anything, a middle-aged man next to him spoke up, "He Tianchu, I think you have stayed in Huanxi Mountain Villa for too long and have long forgotten the rules of our Misty School. How can the books in this pharmacy be open to outsiders?" He Tianchu said with a wry smile, "I know this rule, Senior Brother Chang. But isn't this Zhang Xiaohua also a member of Huanxi Mountain Villa? She is not an outsider. Everyone, do you want to vote for the author? Please collect, thank you." 0. Chapter 119. Senior Brother Chang said, "Are the people from Huanxi Mountain Villa part of the Misty School?" He Tianchu, who told you this? He Tianchu was stunned by the rebuttal. This question really hit the nail on the head, and He Tianchu couldn't answer. Another younger person said, "Senior Brother He, you don't need to waste your time. Our Misty School is very strict when it comes to accepting disciples. Our aptitude is the first choice. This junior brother isn't talented. Although my aptitude isn't the best among the younger generation, it's still above average. I can't be worse than you, Zhang Xiaohua. I've read the medicine books in our hall since I was young, but I couldn't find a solution from these books. Does Senior Brother He really think he can bring you a miracle?" Then, Senior Brother Chang opened his mouth again and said, "This seed didn't germinate, but we didn't put all the blame on you. At worst, you can stay in Huanxi Mountain Villa next year." After he finished speaking, he chuckled. He Tianchu's face turned purple from the two's words. Zhang Xiaohua stood beside He Tianchu and carefully tugged on his clothes. She whispered, "You don't have to help me borrow books, Captain He. The Villa Master has already given me some books." When Hall Master Bai heard this, his eyes flashed and then disappeared. After all, in the Misty School's medicine hall, there were many young elites who were better than Zhang Xiaohua. Any one of them was trained from a young age. When it came to theoretical knowledge, they were 100 times better than Zhang Xiaohua. Although he was a little surprised by Ou Yan's attitude towards Zhang Xiaohua, he didn't care too much. Hall Master Bai waved his hand and said, "Don't quarrel. He Tianchu's intentions are good, but he's too anxious for success. We still have to abide by the sect's rules. It's better not to lend these books. Let's go. Let's take a look at those medicine fields." After he finished speaking, he walked towards the seemingly barren medicinal field at the side. Elder he followed closely behind, as if he couldn't hear their quarrel at all. Senior apprentice brother Chang and the other junior apprentice brother glanced at He Tianchu proudly and followed him. They didn't even bother to look at Zhang Xiaohua. He Tianchu patted Zhang Xiaohua apologetically and followed closely behind. Zhang Xiaohua didn't care too much. He had seen this kind of look many times and had long been used to it. He had his own path, so why should he care about other people's looks? After that, Zhang Xiaohua worked nearby and watched from afar. Everyone seemed to be arguing very fiercely, but they couldn't convince each other. They only dispersed when the sky turned dark. When it was time to eat, Zhang Xiaohua finally saw He Tianchu. He Tianchu's face was very gloomy. Zhang Xiaohua sighed. Flattery was also a skill. The next few days were quite ordinary, and there was nothing to talk about. That night, Zhang Xiaohua was reading his book as usual. He Tianchu walked in with a tired face and said, "Zhang Xiaohua, hurry and pack your things. You're going out with me tomorrow." Zhang Xiaohua wasn't surprised and said, "Okay, Captain He. Why are you in such a hurry? Why didn't you tell me during the day?" He Tianchu smiled bitterly and said, "I also just got the news. How could I tell you earlier?" After he finished speaking, he turned and prepared to leave. However, he suddenly stopped in his tracks and looked back in surprise. Why didn't you ask where we were going? You seemed to know beforehand that we were going out." Zhang Xiaohua smiled and said, "I already gave a heads up when I went to borrow books from the village head. I thought we would leave early, but it dragged on for so long that I thought we weren't going." He Tianchu smiled and said, "I see. However, as you said, it won't be easy to go out this time. I heard that our boss didn't agree, but he couldn't win against the village head. After a few arguments, he finally let us go." Zhang Xiaohua frowned and said, "Boss? Who?" He Tianchu said, "It's the leader of our misty school. Haha, he's our village head's biological brother." Zhang Xiaohua suddenly understood. No wonder Huanxi Manor was so close to the misty school. It should be the case since they were related by blood. Seeing Zhang Xiaohua's expression, He Tianchu said, "There have always been a lot of bloodshed in the pugilistic world." The leader of the Misty School felt sorry for his sister and didn't want her to go far away. Originally, he sent Hall Master Bai from our pharmacy to go, but unfortunately, Hall Master Bai had some grudges with the person the village head was visiting. So, it wasn't only our Hall Master, but also the people from the pharmacy hall. Since the medicinal herbs were planted in Huanxi Manor, the village head felt that he didn't fulfill his duty and insisted on going. "Also, I want to tell you something." As he spoke, He Tianchu's expression became mysterious. Zhang Xiaohua was stunned and said, "It's not a secret, is it? Captain He, if it is, then don't tell me. I'm worried about my life." He Tianchu laughed and scolded, "What kind of life-threatening news do you think I have? I want to know, but I don't have any channels or sources." Then, he said with a look of longing, "The village head is very knowledgeable and has deep attainments in many aspects. Her research on medicinal herbs alone is not inferior to our Hall Master Bai. This is also one of the reasons why she wants to go to the south." Zhang Xiaohua didn't know whether to laugh or cry and said, "What kind of secret is this? I already knew." He Tianchu said in disbelief, "How do you know this? The people in the manor know very little." Zhang Xiaohua picked up the book she was reading from the Kong and handed it to He Tianchu, saying, "You'll know after you read it." He Tianchu opened it and couldn't help but be stunned. He shook his head as he read and muttered, "Amazing, amazing, very pertinent." Then, he said to Zhang Xiaohua, "Brother Xiaohua, aren't we good brothers?" Looking at He Tianchu's warm smile, Zhang Xiaohua suddenly had goosebumps all over his body. A bad feeling rose from the bottom of his heart and he probed, "Captain He, you're my teacher. How would I dare to call you my brother? Is there something you need?" He Tianchu laughed, "Don't talk about master. From today onwards, you're my little brother. If there's anything you need, just tell me. Big brother will definitely help you. He. Zhang Xiaohua was even more certain that He Tianshu was a weasel paying a visit to the chicken. He said carefully, then, Big brother He, do you need anything? He Tianshu said embarrassedly, this, little brother, can you lend me these books to read? Then, he pointed at the large pile of books on the table in embarrassment. Zhang Xiaohua suddenly realized. He rolled his eyes and said, there shouldn't be any problem. But, it's not good to not have the village head's approval. He Tianshu was a little disappointed. Zhang Xiaohua said, aren't we going to the south together tomorrow? I'll bring these books with me, so we'll definitely be together. You can read them together. When there's a chance on the road, I'll ask the village head. We're both eager to learn, so I'm sure the village head will agree. He Tianshu was overjoyed when he heard this. Only then did he reluctantly return the books in his hands to Zhang Xiaohua. Zhang Xiaohua saw He Tianshu's appearance and couldn't help but feel sad. He casually spread out the white paper on the table and skillfully picked up a pen with his left hand and wrote a few words on the paper. He Tianshu saw it and couldn't help but clap his hands and say, not bad, that's what a scholar of my generation should do. The sun shone through the window, and the words on the paper were shining brightly. It said, no comments, no reading. In fact, He Tianshu might have read a few books that Yin lent to Zhang Xiaohua. But in He Tianshu's eyes, the important thing wasn't these books, but Yan's notes on the books. This was Yan's learning method. If he could learn Yan's learning method from these books, he would naturally be able to learn more things. It would be of great help to his development in the pharmacy hall. However, how did Zhang Xiaohua know these? She despised He Tianshu from the bottom of her heart. A dignified person from the pharmacy hall of the Misty School didn't even read these books, but he actually came to compete with her. After He Tianshu left, Zhang Xiaohua simply packed up her belongings. She took out the package that she took from the inner courtyard that day and packed all the books on the table. She heard that she would be gone for a few months. She estimated that she would finish reading these books when she came back. Looking at the big package on the table and the small bag that contained her belongings, Zhang Xiaohua couldn't help but smile. The night gradually deepened. Zhang Xiaohua was lying on the Kong. She was still thinking about He Tianshu's instructions before he went out. Don't tell anyone about going out tomorrow. I will call you tomorrow morning, and we will leave quietly. Zhang Xiaohua was very puzzled. Isn't it just going out? Why does he have to keep it a secret? It's not to avoid debts. Moreover, I don't have two close friends in the villa. Who can I tell? However, Zhang Xiaohua, who was on the Kong bed, did not know that in the deep night, a figure had quietly come out of the manor's inner courtyard. She came to the edge of a forest and carefully looked around. She placed a small piece of paper in a certain spot on a tree and then quietly left. Judging from the figure, it seemed to be a woman. The next morning, Zhang Xiaohua woke up very early. After she finished practicing her fist and sword techniques, she returned to the house to wait for He Tianshu. Not long after Zhang Xiaohua returned to the house, a small servant in green clothes and a small hat quietly came to the forest. It was the tree where the woman hid the note last night. He took the note from the tree and carefully looked at it. He slightly frowned and put it into his clothes. He also looked around before carefully leaving. Zhang Xiaohua returned to the house. Not long after, He Tianshu came to call Zhang Xiaohua with a package on his back. Seeing Zhang Xiaohua carrying a small bag in one hand and a large package in the other, he couldn't help but laugh. He said, why are you carrying so many things? What are they? Zhang Xiaohua said innocently, don't you want to read books? Aren't these books for you? He Tianshu didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He said, you don't have to bring so many books. How many books can I read? But, can I read? Zhang Xiaohua said as she blinked. He Tianshu said helplessly, all right, let's go. He said that he wanted to help Zhang Xiaohua carry the large package. How could Zhang Xiaohua let him carry it? Naturally, she refused. He Tianshu said, if other people see a child like you carrying two packages and following me, won't they criticize me? Although they are all people I know, I can't let them laugh at me. Zhang Xiaohua thought for a moment and gave the small package in her right hand to He Tianshu. She said, it's better to help me carry this. No one will gossip. He Tianshu helplessly took it and urged Zhang Xiaohua to quickly leave the house. The two of them took the packages and went out the door. Then, they followed the small path and walked towards the forest. Not long after, they arrived at the side of another courtyard. When they entered the courtyard, it was a very large courtyard. Right in the middle, there were 4 carriages parked. There were many people in the courtyard who were busy working. However, when Zhang Xiaohua walked into the courtyard, the first thing she saw was a large man standing in front of the first carriage. That large man was taller than the average person by a head. His body was huge and his bare arms revealed strong muscles. He stood there silently like an iron tower. The figures in the courtyard were vague, but he was like a pillar that attracted everyone's attention. Other than Zhang Xiaohua, everyone looked at him with admiration and reverence. Zhang Xiaohua also saw He Tianshu's expression. She carefully pulled on his sleeve and asked, "Who is this? Your boss?" He Tianshu flung his sleeve and said in a small voice, "Zhang Xiaohua, don't talk nonsense. This is our Misty School's #1 strongman called Shernyo. His outer martial arts are very strong. It's said that he has the strength of a few thousand pounds with one arm. He's many times stronger than you." "Oh, a few thousand pounds?" Zhang Xiaohua's eyes lit up. Although she wanted to approach him, she saw that the people around the carriages were far away from him. He Tianshu also didn't go over to greet him, so she didn't dare to approach him. At this time, Qiu Tong came out with some things. When she saw the big package in Zhang Xiaohua's hand, she couldn't help but feel angry and amused. She complained, "Xiaohua, you're not going to travel. Why are you carrying such a big package? Don't tell me it's the books I gave you last time. I remember that it's very heavy. Aren't you afraid that it'll crush the carriage?" Qiu Tong's voice wasn't low, so it attracted Shernyo's attention. When he saw that Zhang Xiaohua was carrying a big package in her left hand, he couldn't help but be surprised. When Zhang Xiaohua heard Qiu Tong talking about her, she replied embarrassedly, "Didn't you say that you'll be gone for a few months? I want to use this time to study. I think I can finish reading all these books, so I brought them with me." Qiu Tong and Shernyo were both surprised to hear that. Qiu Tong knew how many books she gave him last time. When she heard that he wanted to finish reading all of them in a few months, she couldn't help but be surprised. She thought to herself, even if he reads one book every 3 days, he might not be able to finish it. But if he has to read one book every 3 days, how can he completely understand it? When Shernyo heard that the package was full of books, he knew how heavy the package was. He couldn't help but be surprised. This child was very young, but he could easily pick up such a heavy package with one hand. He wasn't simple at all. Perhaps he wasn't as good as Shernyo when he was young, but there wasn't much difference. Whose disciple was this child? Qiu Tong continued, "All right, put your package in the last carriage. But you have to read carefully. There's no point in flipping through the books casually. Don't waste the manor master's good intentions." Zhang Xiaohua smiled and said, "Sister, don't worry. I know what I'm doing." After speaking, she followed He Tianshu to the last carriage. The carriage was very spacious. It was even more spacious than the ones Zhang Xiaohua had sat in before. There was actually a space similar to a bookcase. It was probably for storing things. Zhang Xiaohua opened the package and put some books on it. She put the package to one side. He Tianshu put his own package and Zhang Xiaohua's small package on the carriage and then got down. After Zhang Xiaohua tidied up a little and got down from the carriage, there were a lot fewer people in the courtyard. They were probably ready to stop. At this time, Zhang Xiaohua felt that someone was looking at her. When she turned her head, she saw that it was Shernyo. Zhang Xiaohua nodded and smiled at him. Just as she was about to go over and talk to him, a group of people came out from the small door in the courtyard. At the front was the manor master of Huanxi Manor, O Yin. Behind O Yin was Big Sister Qin, who Zhang Xiaohua saw in the inner courtyard. Why did she look so special? It was because there were a few young women with good figures following behind her. They were all dressed in tight clothes and had swords at their waists. They looked valiant and formidable. Even though Zhang Xiaohua wasn't at the age of first awakening of love, she still wanted to take a few more glances at them. In such an atmosphere, how could Big Sister Qin not stand out? However, Big Sister Qin was calm. She followed O Yin down the steps. The few women behind her kept a distance from them. Their expressions were very respectful. Oyen walked in front of Shernyo and said with a smile, "Shernyo, you must have been here a long time ago." Shernyo said naively, "Manor Master, you're early." "Not too early. I've been here for an hour." Oyen continued, "Then I'll have to trouble you along the way." Shernyo said, "It's my duty." Big sect leader said that I must ensure Manor Master's safety. Otherwise, I won't be allowed to drink when I return. Oyen smiled faintly and looked around. She asked Chiu Tong, who was walking over, "Is everything ready?" Chiu Tong said in a low voice, "Yes, Mississippi. Everything is ready." Oyen nodded in satisfaction. "Then let's go. The journey is long. The sooner we leave, the sooner we can return." With that, she boarded the first carriage with Chiu Tong's help. After that, Big Sister Qin and Chiu Tong also boarded the first carriage. The remaining female disciples sat in the second carriage. Zhang Xiaohua, He Tianshu, and the rest of the people sat in the last two carriages. After everyone had boarded the carriages, Shernyo boarded the first carriage. He picked up his whip and drove the carriage out of the courtyard. The other coachmen followed him. Just like that, Zhang Xiaohua's journey to the south officially began. Not long after Oyen's carriage left the manor, a few servants in green clothes and hats asked for leave and left Huanxi Manor together. When they reached Pingyang City, they went their separate ways. One of them went to the provision store. He had gone to the forest to retrieve the note in the morning. Not long after, that servant came out with the things he bought and disappeared into the crowd. Just like that, news of Oyen's journey was secretly found out by people with ulterior motives. However, no one knew what they were up to. However, all this had nothing to do with Zhang Xiaohua. Zhang Xiaohua sat in the carriage curiously and looked at the scenery by the roadside. Although Lu Town was in the south of Pingyang City, it was slightly to the west. Oyen's destination this time was to the east. Hence, after leaving the manor, she did not head to Pingyang City. Instead, she took a shortcut and headed to the main road in the east. It was already late autumn, and everything was withering. The crops in the fields had already been harvested, and the empty fields could be seen far away. The terrain near Pingyang City was similar to that of Lu Town. It was mostly mountainous, and there were still many wild fruits and weeds on the undulating hills. From time to time, one could see villagers carrying small baskets or herding a flock of sheep. They shrunk their necks as they walked back and forth on the hills. Naturally, Zhang Xiaohua felt sad for Gu Jingji. She thought of her hometown and her parents. It had been almost a year since she last saw them. How were they doing? No book reviews, no reading. Haha. Everyone, please do a survey on the author and vote. Please vote. Please bookmark it. Thank you. 0. Chapter 120. Shernyo steered the carriage steadily through a short path and soon entered the main road. At this time, there were not many people and carriages on the road. Shernyo drove the carriage even faster. The three carriages behind were also chasing after them. However, the driver's skills were quickly shown and the three carriages were left far behind. Shernyo did not seem to know and continued to ride at full speed. He was enjoying this long-awaited feeling. Fortunately, the attentive Chiu Tong noticed and stopped him. Shernyo said embarrassedly, "I haven't driven in a long time. It was an accident. I will drive slower next time." Shernyo slowed down and the carriages behind finally caught up. Elder Sister Qin frowned and said, "Shernyo, it's right to drive faster. However, you must ensure the safety of the village head. If you do this, won't there be no one to protect the village head?" Shernyo did not like to hear this and said, "If we meet an enemy, how can we rely on the people behind us? Won't we still have to rely on our strength?" Elder Sister Qin smiled and said, "I know it's hard to talk to people like you. In this martial world, not only is there strength, there is also intelligence. You have to know that it's easy to dodge a spear in the open, but hard to defend against a stab in the dark. It's better to be careful." Shernyo was also somewhat fearful and respectful of Elder Sister Qin. He did not say anything else but carefully controlled the speed of the carriage so that the carriages behind did not have to spend much effort to catch up. After traveling for a while, they were already far away from Pingyang City. There were fewer people on the road and more carriages. There were also many fields by the roadside, and from time to time, Villages appeared in their vision. The sun was high up in the sky, shining down on the earth. It was a good day with clear skies. Shernyo seemed to be in high spirits as he drove the carriage and sang, "Sister, you take the bow. I will walk on the shore." Shernyo's voice was as loud as his body, and everyone in the 4 carriages could hear him. They could not help but look at him in a different light. They did not expect such a boorish man to be so gentle. A few of the female disciples also showed gentleness in their eyes. However, it was not long before Shernyo's tale was revealed. Shernyo only knew this one song. Along the way, from morning to night, he only sang a few lines. Sigh. Even the most delicious food could not withstand eating it every day, let alone a few simple songs. At night, when it was time to find lodging, except for the stone cow, everyone had the thought of foaming at the mouth. For a long journey, the most important thing was to arrange food and lodging. Fortunately, Chotong had taken this route some time ago. Before they left the manor, everyone had already discussed the route, resting, eating, and lodging. They just had to follow the plan. That night, they stayed in an inn in a small town. Although it was an inn, it was much better than the carriage house Zhang Xiaohua used to stay in. Huanxi Villa's people had booked the only small courtyard of the inn, which made the chubby boss of the inn smile so much that his eyes narrowed into slits. He was busy in front and behind of people, for fear that he would offend the rare distinguished guests. Unfortunately, when the people from the villa entered the small courtyard, 2 disciples guarded the courtyard door, preventing others from entering or leaving. Even the boss of the inn was stopped outside the door. Everyone's food was bought from the town, which made the boss, who was guarding the door, feel a bit of heartache. This was not a small amount of income. However, when he thought about it, the money they gave to stay in the inn was far beyond his expectations. He quickly dismissed the idea of complaining. Although it was already late, the people in the manor were truly capable. Not long after, they brought back a lot of things from town. The chef who followed them started the fire, and not long after, they made 2 or 3 tables of food. Zhang Xiaohua was not a manservant of the manor, but he could not eat with Yin and the others in the main hall like He Tianshu. He could only eat a simple meal with everyone in the small room. After eating, lanterns were lit all over the small courtyard. This courtyard was not small, and there were many rooms. Zhang Xiaohua could actually stay in one room with He Tianshu. When Zhang Xiaohua was about to read by the light, He Tianshu called out to her and said, "Zhang Xiaohua, do you want to go out with me?" Zhang Xiaohua was stunned and said, "It's already so late. Why don't you go to bed early? Why go out?" He Tianshu smiled and said, "Of course there is a reason. Do you want to go?" Zhang Xiaohua frowned and suddenly thought of Ma Jing. Could it be that Captain He also had such a hobby? Zhang Xiaohua advised, "Captain He, you've been walking for a whole day. Aren't you tired? It's better to rest early. Also, I heard that those places are not clean. It's better not to go there." He Tianshu was stunned and immediately laughed. He knocked Zhang Xiaohua's head and said, "You little child, you know quite a lot. It's said that scholars are more scheming." Sure enough, the Zhang Xiaohua before learning to read didn't know these things. Zhang Xiaohua covered her head and said with grievance, "So what if I know? It's better than you going there." He Tianshu smiled and said, "What are you thinking? I think it's still early. You should know the principle that fists don't leave your hands and music doesn't leave your mouth. Can you practice your fists today? We can go out and relax." Zhang Xiaohua finally understood He Tianshu's meaning. She was even more embarrassed and said, "It's better not to go. What time is it? I still want to go to bed early." He Tianshu said, "Zhang Xiaohua, you don't know the best time to practice. It's best to practice martial arts during the 8 hours of the meridian period. The meridian period is the time when yin and yang alternate. It's the most suitable time to practice internal energy. Although you don't know how to practice internal energy, it's still very beneficial for you to practice fist techniques. Forget it, are you going or not?" Zhang Xiaohua hesitated and said, "Captain He, I sleep early. I don't think I've made it past the meridian period. All right, since I don't have time to practice at noon and at night, I'll go with you." Thus, He Tianshu brought Zhang Xiaohua out. There were a few disciples standing guard outside the small courtyard. He Tianshu told them and then left the small courtyard. Just as they left the small courtyard, they bumped into the chubby inn owner. Seeing someone come out of the small courtyard, the chubby owner greeted them with a smile. When he heard that He Tianshu wanted to find a place with a forest, he was stunned. After thinking for a long time, he pointed out the location and even wanted a waiter to lead them there. He Tianshu naturally didn't want others to follow them. He rejected the chubby owner's good intentions and brought Zhang Xiaohua out of the inn. Zhang Xiaohua didn't really remember the way. She didn't hear what the inn owner said. With Captain He leading the way, she didn't need to worry about this kind of thing. But not long after, Zhang Xiaohua felt that something was wrong. In front of her, He Tianshu would hesitate every time he walked to a street. Zhang Xiaohua suspected that He Tianshu was lost. Sure enough, after walking a few streets, He Tianshu stopped and turned around to ask Zhang Xiaohua, "Are we going the right way?" Zhang Xiaohua rolled her eyes and said, "You're the one leading the way. How would I know if it's right or not? Moreover, I'm born with a poor sense of direction. I can't remember from the medicine field to the entrance of the villa, let alone this unfamiliar place." He Tianshu smiled bitterly and said, "I see. We have to find someone to ask for directions." But it was late at night, and there were few people on the road. No one knew where He Tianshu went. It was dark, so where could they find someone to ask? He Tianshu looked around and pointed to a small lantern in front of them and said, "Let's go. We'll take a look there and find someone to ask. If it doesn't work, then we'll go back to the inn." Zhang Xiaohua naturally didn't have any objections and followed He Tianshu to the lantern. When they walked to the light, they found that it was actually a small weapon store. It was so late yet it wasn't closed. He Tianshu also felt strange. He Tianshu walked into the store. Although it wasn't completely dark inside, there was only one oil lamp. He couldn't see clearly, but as soon as he walked into the store, he could smell the smell of alcohol. When he looked again, he saw a person dressed as a blacksmith sleeping soundly on the table. The two suddenly realized that it wasn't that the owner was diligent, but that he went to bed too early and forgot to close the door. There were a lot of swords and knives in the store. They must have been made by this blacksmith. He Tianshu didn't rush to wake up the owner. He picked up a steel knife and looked at it with interest. In fact, there was nothing strange about it. It was like a scholar who would go to a bookstore on the street to take a look. But whether they would buy books or not, it was inevitable that they would find a few books to flip through. It was the same for people who practiced martial arts. When they entered a weapon store, they could not take a few weapons to appreciate. This wasn't pretending to be cultured. It must be the same for people who were gay. However, when he looked at the steel knife in his hand, He Tianshu's casual expression changed a lot. He didn't expect that the small store he casually walked into would have such good quality weapons. Immediately, He Tianshu began to choose seriously. He wanted to look carefully to see if there was anything better. Zhang Xiaohua was not interested in these. However, the street was very deserted. The store was better. There were snoring sounds and people's shadows. He also walked around casually. He Tianshu was a swordsman. Of course, he chose a steel sword. He picked from one end of the shelf to the other end, but he didn't find anything better. When it came to the quality of the sword, there was nothing to say. It was very good. However, compared to the sword He Tianshu used, it was still a little worse. It was difficult for him to have the idea of paying for it. When he reached the end, he saw a dagger-like object at the bottom of the shelf. It was so dark that he couldn't see it clearly, so he bent down and picked it up. The dagger was cold to the touch and was quite heavy. When He Tianshu held it in front of his eyes, he saw that it wasn't an ordinary dagger. Instead of saying that it was a dagger, it was better to say that it was a small sword. Ordinary daggers had a wooden handle and a sharp blade in front, but this dagger looked the same as a sword. The hilt and the blade were one piece. They were both made of a kind of metal. However, the ratio of the blade and the hilt was not coordinated. The hilt was smaller than a common sword, but the blade was much smaller than a common sword. He Tianshu carefully touched the blade with his hand. It seemed that there was no edge. He couldn't help but frown. What is this? A child's toy? He raised his head and was about to wake the shopkeeper up when he saw Zhang Xiaohua walking around in boredom. Zhang Xiaohua turned around and looked at the sword hilt in his hand, which was one size smaller. He called out, "Zhang Xiaohua, come over here. I have something good for you." Zhang Xiaohua responded and came over. She looked at the thing that He Tianshu handed over and asked curiously, Captain He, what is this? It looks like a toy sword, but it's much bigger than the one I played with when I was young. He Tianshu smiled and said, it's probably something that the blacksmith made for fun. Take a look. If you like it, I'll buy it for you to play with. Zhang Xiaohua didn't take it and said, I'm not a child. If you want to buy it, buy me a real sword. He Tianshu said, you didn't learn any sword skills. Why buy a sword? Moreover, he suddenly stopped. He wanted to say, can you still use a sword with your hand? But when he thought that this would hurt Zhang Xiaohua's heart, he quickly shut his mouth. Zhang Xiaohua didn't understand and asked, moreover, what's wrong? He Tianshu quickly covered it up and said, moreover, I don't know how expensive this sword is. I'll think about it. Zhang Xiaohua made a "biffed" sound and turned to leave, saying, then I don't want this toy either. However, when he turned around, he accidentally touched a sword. Clang! The sword fell to the ground. The sound wasn't soft. The blacksmith who was sleeping suddenly raised his head and shouted, catch the thief! When he saw He Tianshu holding a small sword and Zhang Xiaohua standing there, he hurriedly wiped the saliva from his mouth and walked over with a smile, saying, excuse me, dear guest, what have you taken a fancy to? I was just dreaming. Sorry. Zhang Xiaohua bent down and picked up the sword with her left hand. She held it in her hand and said, if you didn't wake up, we would have taken this sword away. The blacksmith smiled and said, look at the two of you. How could you be that kind of person? You must be joking. You must be joking. The light in the shop was dim, but he could still see that the other people's temperament was not ordinary. This blacksmith's eyes were not ordinary. The blacksmith looked at the small sword in He Tianshu's hand and said, dear customer's eyes are really unique. This is our shop's treasure. It has been passed down for 100 years. Today, you took a fancy to it at first glance. This one will have to bear the pain and part with it. He Tianshu smiled and used his hand to rub the dust off the small sword, saying, this is the treatment of a shop's treasure? Why didn't you cover it with something? Moreover, what are you using this shop's treasure for? Is it a dagger? Why don't you have a blade? Is it a treasure sword? Why is it so small? The blacksmith was speechless and said embarrassedly, all right, then I can only tell the truth. 100 years ago, when my grandfather's grandfather was still alive, an old man with white hair and beard pawned it in our shop. He said it was an immortal's treasure. If you don't believe me, you can weigh it. How heavy is it? Would a normal metal weigh this much? He Tianshu was still smiling, saying, I find it strange. Why didn't he pawn it at a pawn shop? Why did he come here? Forget it. I originally wanted to buy a treasure sword, but I won't look. As he said this, he put the small sword on the shelf and prepared to leave. The blacksmith quickly stopped him, saying, all right, dear customer, you are really amazing. I will tell you the truth. This is a toy that I found in the countryside. It looks quite heavy. I originally wanted to put it in the furnace to melt a weapon, but no matter how hard I tried, it wouldn't melt. So I just left it there. I wanted to sell it to children, but it was too heavy. Not many children would like to play with it, so I left it there for many years. Dear customer, if you take a look at other weapons and buy a lot, I will give this toy to you for free. How about it? He Tianshu curled his lips, saying, buy a lot? I see that your shop is so remote. How much business can you have? Moreover, I am just one person. How many treasured swords can I buy? However, seeing that your craftsmanship is not bad, I will take a look first. After he finished speaking, he casually handed the small sword to Zhang Xiaohua. Zhang Xiaohua's left hand was holding the treasured sword, so she could only use her right hand to take it. Just as the blacksmith said, it was quite heavy. No wonder children couldn't play with it. Then, she also casually handed the treasured sword in her left hand to He Tianshu. He Tianshu took the treasured sword that Zhang Xiaohua handed over and carefully looked at it, saying, this treasured sword is really not bad. Shopkeeper, what is the price? When the blacksmith saw that He Tianshu had taken a liking to it, he said, customer, you really have a good eye. This is my shop's treasure. As he said this, he saw He Tianshu frown and hurriedly changed his words. Oh, I'm wrong. This is my grandfather's work, and it has been here for many years. You really have a good eye. Just based on your eye, I won't give you a lower price. He Tianchu smiled, saying, Is your grandfather Oyezi? The blacksmith was stunned, saying, No. He Tianchu said, If it is Oyezi, not to mention 20 taels, even if it is 2,000 taels, I will buy it. However, if it is not, then the price is too expensive. The blacksmith asked, Then how much does dear customer think is suitable? Tianchu said, 2 taels is enough. The blacksmith angrily said, Are you trying to dismiss a beggar? You have no sincerity at all. After he finished speaking, he pretended to snatch the sword. He Tianchu did not make a move and let him grab the treasured sword. However, the blacksmith did not take it over and only said, If dear customer is sincere, you might as well add a little more. Zhang Xiaohua watched the two talk from the side and felt that it was very boring. She took the small sword in her hand and looked at it in front of her eyes. Although this small sword was full of dust, it looked dark and there was a faint reflection inside. Zhang Xiaohua felt that it was very strange and used her left hand to brush off the dust on the small sword. However, when her left hand touched the small sword, she suddenly had a strange feeling. It was as if this small sword had a connection with her left hand. But when she took her left hand away, the feeling immediately disappeared. Thus, Zhang Xiaohua transferred the small sword from her right hand to her left hand. The moment she touched it, a blood connection was born from the bottom of her heart. It was as if this small sword was her left hand. Or it could be said that a small sword grew out of her left hand. It was very strange. When Zhang Xiaohua used her right hand to brush off the dust on the sword and looked carefully, she did not find anything. It was just that the dark metal did not reflect any light. Occasionally, she could see a trace of light from the small sword's body. She did not know if it was because she saw it under the light. However, no matter what this small sword was, whether it was a toy or a dagger, Zhang Xiaohua decided that she must have it. At this time, the blacksmith and He Tianchu's confrontation had basically ended. He Tianchu said, How about this? Let's not talk anymore. Let's each take a step back. 7 taels of silver. 0. Chapter 121. The blacksmith seemed to have found an organization and his face was full of joy as he said, Good, brother. Since you're so straightforward, I can't bear to part with my treasure. I'll be friends with you. 7 taels it is, 7 taels it is. In the future, you must visit my store more often. He Tianchu smiled and said, Of course, I still have a group of brothers. If I take it back and they like it, I'll definitely pull them over. However, when the time comes, boss must give me a discount. The blacksmith also smiled and said, No problem. The first time it's unfamiliar, the second time it's familiar. If you become a regular customer, there will naturally be benefits. At this time, Zhang Xiaohua pulled on the corner of He Tianchu's clothes. He Tianchu looked back at the small sword in Zhang Xiaohua's hand and said to the blacksmith, This small sword, my little brother likes it. Why don't you let him pick it up and play with it? The blacksmith didn't mind. He waved his hand and said, No problem. Didn't I just say that this toy is a gift from me to the little brother? Just bring a few more people to patronize another day. Everyone was happy. He Tianchu paid the money and asked for the way back to the inn. Only then did he leave the weapon store with Zhang Xiaohua. Along the way, He Tianchu was very happy. At such a cheap price, he found a very good treasure sword. It was much better than going to the forest to practice martial arts. It seemed that in the future, it would be better to come out more often. Zhang Xiaohua was also very happy. She held the small sword in her left hand and kept waving it around as if her arm had suddenly grown. However, she didn't notice that at this time, it was indeed too late. There was no one on the street. As she walked, Zhang Xiaohua felt sleepy and couldn't help but close her eyes. She softly laid on the ground and tightly held the small sword in her hand. He Tianchu was even more amused. Along the way, he lovingly looked at his treasure sword. After walking for a while, he found that Zhang Xiaohua's footsteps were gone. When he looked back, he couldn't find her figure. He Tianchu couldn't help but feel anxious. Cold sweat broke out on his forehead. Where did this expert come from? He didn't even notice it. Could it be one of the top experts in Jianghu? When He Tianchu arrived with his sword in hand, he saw Zhang Xiaohua lying motionless on the ground from afar. He became even more nervous and cautious. Seeing that there was no movement in the surroundings, he took a few steps forward and felt a little bitter. This child was fine just a moment ago, but in the blink of an eye, he had fallen into such a state. How was he going to explain this to his brother? When he arrived in front of him, he carefully examined him, but did not find any injuries on his body. He could not help but think, could this be the legendary acupoint strike? Did someone hit his Achilles heel? In the midst of his nervousness, a very familiar sound suddenly came from Zhang Xiaohua's nose. Tianshu didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He had been worried for half a day in vain. It turned out that this fellow had fallen asleep. But when Tianshu went forward and kicked Zhang Xiaohua a few times, Tianshu was worried. He couldn't even kick him awake. Could it be that he had to carry him back? The next morning, the sun rose from the horizon. As usual, Zhang Xiaohua opened her eyes and blankly looked at the unfamiliar surroundings. Only then did she remember that she was not in the familiar little house. Then she realized that her left hand was still firmly holding onto something. When she picked it up, it turned out to be a toy sword. Only then did she remember the situation last night, but she didn't know how she came back. How strange. Looking at Tianshu, who was still sleeping on the Kong bed, Zhang Xiaohua quietly got off the bed, still holding the little sword in her hand. When she walked out of the house, the sky was already bright. But it was still early, so no one had gotten up. Only 2 Misty School disciples were standing in a hidden corner, loyally guarding their duty. When they saw Zhang Xiaohua leave the house, they ignored her and continued to vigilantly observe their surroundings. Zhang Xiaohua walked to the middle of the yard and carefully looked at the little sword in her hand. Last night, the lights in the shop were dim, so she didn't get a good look. Now that she looked at it, she realized that it was originally just a toy. The sword was not long, about 4 to 5 inches long and 2 fingers wide. The hilt was also very small, just right for Zhang Xiaohua's small hand to hold. The whole body of the little sword was black, as if it was made of a kind of metal. It was cold to the touch and didn't warm up because of holding it for a long time. The dark body of the sword couldn't be seen, but Zhang Xiaohua clearly felt that there seemed to be blood in the sword. The blade of the sword wasn't opened, so it felt blunt to the touch. If it wasn't for the fact that it was very heavy, Zhang Xiaohua would really think that it was a toy for children. Zhang Xiaohua's left hand was very strong, so the weight of the little sword was negligible. He casually held the little sword and waved it left and right. He felt very comfortable and happy in his heart. He couldn't help but think that if he used this little sword as a treasure sword to practice swordsmanship, wouldn't it be better than holding a tree branch every day? Thinking of sword moves, Zhang Xiaohua's hand couldn't help but feel a little itchy. He practiced swordsmanship yesterday morning and didn't practice it in the afternoon and at night. Now that he got a toy as strong as a tree branch, of course, he wanted to show off his skills. In fact, the yard was quite spacious. It was okay to practice boxing and swordsmanship, but how could Zhang Xiaohua let others see his boxing skills behind closed doors? Therefore, he still left the small yard. The inn was located at the end of a street, next to a small river and a small bridge. Zhang Xiaohua walked to the river and looked along the river. Just behind the inn was a pond. Opposite the pond was just like Zhang Xiaohua's home in the Guozhuang house. There was a small bamboo forest. Zhang Xiaohua's eyes lit up, and he walked towards the bamboo forest. Sure enough, as Zhang Xiaohua thought, there was an empty space in the bamboo forest. Moreover, there was no one here. Zhang Xiaohua got into a fighting stance and practiced the Big Dipper magical fist 9 times. He let the thicker and thicker flow throughout his body before he stopped. Following that, Zhang Xiaohua carefully looked around to make sure there was no one around. Only then did he use the small sword and perform the 16 sword moves. He didn't know if it was because he changed the tree branch or because he was in a good mood, but these few sword moves were very smooth. The nameless warm flow happily flowed from his shoulder to Zhang Xiaohua's left hand. In the past, the warm flow would disappear when it reached his left hand, but it didn't disappear now. All of it flowed into the small sword in Zhang Xiaohua's hand. That small sword, under Zhang Xiaohua's brandishing, actually gradually emitted a black light, but it was very thin and not noticeable. At the end of Zhang Xiaohua's practice, the sword moves were very exciting. Just like that night at the mountain villa, He changed the moves and stabbed towards the bamboo that was as thick as a small bowl in front of him. In fact, Zhang Xiaohua thought that he could use the tree branch to pierce a small hole in the big tree. Although the bamboo was hollow, its surface was much harder than the big tree. Even if he changed the tree branch, with the small sword stick-like tip, he would only be able to pierce a small hole in the bamboo. However, the result was greatly out of Zhang Xiaohua's expectations. When the blunt tip of the sword pierced the hard bamboo, the bamboo's outer shell was like paper. The small sword pierced through the bamboo without any hindrance and came out from the other side. Zhang Xiaohua was shocked. He quickly withdrew the small sword and looked at the bamboo in disbelief. However, the hole in the bamboo was still there, so he couldn't doubt it. Thus, he went up again and carefully touched the bamboo until he confirmed that there was nothing wrong with the bamboo and that it was very hard. Only then did he look at his left hand and the small sword in it. Since when did he become so powerful? Elder Yu used a long sword to pierce through a big tree was very powerful, but he could actually use this stick-like small sword to pierce through the hard bamboo. Although it was not as good as Elder Yu's, it was far, far better than others. Zhang Xiaohua didn't dare to think about this. After all, he had never seen others practice the sword and didn't know the power of others' swords. At least, he knew that he had far exceeded his expectations. At this time, there was already a commotion by the bamboo forest. Zhang Xiaohua quickly came out of the bamboo forest. This wasn't the mountain villa. Looking at the time, maybe the people in the mountain villa had already packed up and were preparing to leave. When Zhang Xiaohua quickly ran back to the inn, most of the people had already eaten breakfast and were packing up. He Tianshu was also standing there with a frown. When he saw Zhang Xiaohua come in, his frown loosened and he asked with some anger, "Zhang Xiaohua, where did you run off to so early in the morning? Why did you let everyone wait for you?" Zhang Xiaohua quickly apologized and said, "Captain He, didn't you say yesterday that you can't leave your mouth and your fists? I went out early in the morning to practice my fists." He Tianshu looked at the small sword in his hand and found it funny in his heart. He knew that he had a child's temperament and that he would definitely play with this toy. So he seriously said, "Practicing your fists is a good thing, but it also depends on the occasion. We are outside, so we must be careful and don't cause any trouble. It's better to keep this toy close to your chest. Don't hold it in your hand every day and make others laugh at you. All right, let's go eat." The village head has already finished eating and is preparing to leave. Zhang Xiaohua put the small sword into his chest and hurriedly ate his breakfast. He simply packed up his things and boarded the carriage. The 4 carriages gradually went further and further away. The fat boss was still standing there, reluctant to part. What a good guest. He only stayed for one night and did not eat the inn's food, but he was actually given so much money. If he had such a guest every day, it would be hard for him not to become rich. Originally, the fat boss thought that he would keep this beautiful memory in his heart and slowly savor it in the future. But before noon, a man in embroidered clothes riding a handsome horse came to the inn to inquire about the whereabouts of yesterday's group of people. His face was full of temptation, and the fat boss couldn't help but recall yesterday's beautiful time in full detail. When the brocade-clothed man left in satisfaction, the fat boss once again sighed in admiration. What a good customer. Even after the man had left, he could still bring him fortune. He really had to thank the spirits of his ancestors. The people of Huanxi Mountain Villa naturally didn't know about this and were still hurrying on their way. However, today wasn't as fresh as yesterday. Even Zhang Xiaohua, who didn't go out much, didn't really enjoy the scenery outside. It was only a day's journey away from Pingyang City. The scenery and culture along the way were really not much different from the place where she lived. After seeing so much, of course, she would get tired of it. Moreover, Shernyo's voice was really good. From yesterday to today, it was still very loud and clear. Those few lines of the lyrics always lingered in their ears. It must be that he drank a lot of wine in the inn last night, and his throat was well nourished. Therefore, a few disciples secretly muttered that when they stayed the night again, they must reduce the amount of wine Shernyo drank so that his voice would become hoarse. His singing was good, but if they kept hearing these few lines, how could they live in the future? Zhang Xiaohua and He Tianshu sat in the third carriage. There were a few disciples beside them, and they were chatting about something. However, Zhang Xiaohua didn't mind. His left hand was playing with the small sword, and his right hand was holding a book, reading it with great interest. Zhang Xiaohua's right hand hadn't fully recovered. From the outside, it looked the same as when he first returned to the villa. However, Zhang Xiaohua knew very well that his right hand wasn't like what Elder Yu said. His bones and meridians weren't destroyed by his inner energy and couldn't return to normal. He could feel that his hand was recovering at a perceptible speed. Moreover, he often tried to use his right hand now. He believed that one day, he would give everyone an unexpected surprise. He Tianshu sat in the innermost part of the carriage, resting with his eyes closed. He was also holding a book in his hand. He seemed to be thinking about something. After a while, a smile appeared on his face and he opened his eyes. He raised his eyes to look at the scenery outside the window and frowned. Although there was some distance between them and the stone cow, the singing voice traveled quite far and he could hear it clearly. When his gaze landed on Zhang Xiaohua, he couldn't help but smile. He looked at the small sword in Zhang Xiaohua's left hand and said with a smile, "Zhang Xiaohua, this toy isn't bad, right? It seems like you like it very much." When Zhang Xiaohua heard this, he put down his book and looked at the small sword in his hand. He said sincerely, "Yes, Captain He. I really like this small sword. Thank you for giving it to me." He Tianshu waved his hand and said, "Actually, I didn't spend a single silver. It's just a gift. I don't need it so naturally. I'm giving it to you to play with. Luckily, this toy doesn't have a blade, so I'm not afraid of hurting you." Zhang Xiaohua said, "Didn't you still buy a treasured sword? I see that you already have one in your hand. Why do you still want to buy another one?" He Tianshu smiled and said, "My original sword isn't some famous weapon. It's just a low-value and consumable item. I have to change it every once in a while. I saw that the steel sword in the shop is pretty good. It's worth at least 15 taels of silver in Pingyang City. I bought it for 7 taels of silver. Of course, it's worth it. Moreover, the owner of the shop even gave me a buy one get one free. Although it's a toy, it still makes me very happy. So you don't have to specially thank me." What he didn't know was that in the small town far away, the blacksmith arrogantly came to the pork shop. He generously threw a few silver taels to the butcher and called out, "Lao Lu, I'll return you the money from a few days ago. Also, give me some offal. Hurry up, I still have to go to the wine shop to buy some wine." The butcher said in surprise, "Old Tai, why are you so generous today? Did you open a shop?" The blacksmith said proudly, "Yesterday, a big head came out of nowhere and actually bought a steel sword for 7 taels of silver. Don't you think I'm lucky?" The butcher smacked his tongue and said, "What a spendthrift. Usually, no one would buy your steel sword for 2 or 3 taels of silver. You actually managed to get such a good price." As he said that, he didn't delay and quickly prepared food for the blacksmith. Then, the blacksmith seemed to have thought of something and said, "Oh right, the toy that your mistress picked up on the mountain 2 years ago. Yesterday, I gave it to that person. I told you that if you could sell it, I would give you money. However, I gave you a buy one get one free deal. Let's just take it as 5 copper coins." The butcher said unhappily, "That customer must have bought your steel sword at such a high price because you gave it to him. How can he just give me 5 copper coins to dismiss me?" The blacksmith angrily said, "The toy that your mistress picked up was left in my shop for 3 years and no one paid attention to it. If you don't want these 5 copper coins, I will chase after that customer and get it back." The butcher smiled apologetically and said, "Then 5 copper coins is too little. No matter what, you have to add a little more." The blacksmith laughed and scolded, "I knew that you had such thoughts. I'll give you 15 copper coins. It can be considered as not letting your mistress down." After saying that, he took out a handful of copper coins from his bosom and placed them on the meat table. The butcher used lightning speed to put away the copper coins and said with a smile, "Since it was all picked up, this money is also free. When your mistress picks up something again, she will let you sell it." The blacksmith repeatedly waved his hand and said, "Don't, let's go to a pawn shop. That toy has been in my shop for 3 years. I don't want to get involved in this kind of business. Hurry up and get me into the water. I still have wine to sell. Today's weather is good. It's a good day to get drunk." The blacksmith took the meat and hurriedly left. The butcher also carried on with his business. As for Zhang Xiaohua, she did not know that the small sword that she loved so much was only worth 15 copper coins. Zhang Xiaohua was still very grateful to He Tianshu and said, "Captain He, I won't say any more words of thanks. If there is anything in the future, just let me know." He Tianshu smiled and raised the book in his hand and slightly waved it. Zhang Xiaohua understood and also laughed and did not say anything more. After a while, He Tianshu said, "Zhang Xiaohua, why did you sleep on the street last night?" Zhang Xiaohua said in surprise, "Really? Captain He, I have always wanted to ask you. When I woke up in the morning, I only remembered what happened in the weapon shop. I don't know anything after that. So it was me who slept on the street." He Tianshu smiled and said, "That's right. You were walking behind me, and I suddenly lost sight of you. I was scared. When I turned around to look, I found you lying on the ground and actually sleeping. You don't know?" Zhang Xiaohua said embarrassedly, "I really don't know. Captain He, my brother said that when I sleep, you can't wake me up. He didn't say that I would suddenly fall asleep. Also, I have never gone out so late." He Tianshu frowned and said, "This is a problem. I don't know if you fall asleep at midnight every day. Otherwise, it will be troublesome." Zhang Xiaohua asked curiously, "How troublesome?" He Tianshu explained, "Midnight is the time when yin and yang are alternating. Many inner strength cultivation methods require you to cultivate at midnight. If you are like this, how can you cultivate these inner strength cultivation methods?" Zhang Xiaohua said somewhat anxiously, "Then what do I do?" He Tianshu smiled and said, "There is no need to be so anxious. There are many inner strength cultivation methods that do not require you to cultivate at that time. We'll talk about it again when you find the opportunity to cultivate your inner force." Zhang Xiaohua thought about it and did not ask anymore. 0. Chapter 122. The days on the road were extremely boring. However, Zhang Xiaohua didn't have high requirements. She had books to read every day, so she didn't care whether she was in the carriage or in her own room. On the contrary, she didn't have to work in the fields, so she had more time to study. The carriage traveled for another 10 days. During this time, the stone cow's singing didn't stop. At first, everyone admired it, but later, they hated it. In the end, they couldn't bear it anymore. Finally, Manor Lord O took action. Under the Manor Lord's obstruction, the stone cow stopped singing for half a day. However, when it was almost evening, the stone cow couldn't hold back and started singing again when it saw the splendid sunset. Oyen didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She could only let Aunt Chin talk to her to relieve her boredom. As for the people behind, they slightly distanced themselves from the stone cow. After listening for a long time, they turned a blind eye to it. They just treated it as a giant human-shaped crow making noise. In the first few days, Zhang Xiaohua would drag He Tianshu out to find a place to practice martial arts every night. However, He Tianshu seemed to have learned his lesson from the first day and always refused. Zhang Xiaohua could only go out to practice martial arts by herself. After a few days, she felt strange and secretly asked He Tianshu the reason. He Tianshu smiled and asked Zhang Xiaohua if she saw the other disciples go out to practice martial arts or practice in the yard. Zhang Xiaohua thought about it carefully. She really hadn't seen them practice martial arts. Only then did He Tianshu tell her the reason. It turned out that He Tianshu was the same as the other disciples. They all practiced internal strength. Those who practiced martial arts knew that they trained their muscles, bones, and skin externally and their qi internally. Most of the internal strength practice was to meditate, gather qi, and circulate the internal strength. In fact, practicing martial arts was to exercise the muscles and bones. Just like Nie Xiao and the others in Huanxi Manor, they also practiced internal strength at night. Practicing martial arts in the morning and evening was to exercise the muscles and bones, and also to familiarize themselves with the martial arts. Since they were far away and had no place to exercise, they could naturally cancel the practice of martial arts and focus on practicing internal strength. Moreover, according to He Tianshu, when the internal strength practice reached a certain level, it could replace sleep at night. They just needed to meditate for a few hours at night. Hearing this, Zhang Xiaohua felt a burst of admiration. If she didn't need to sleep by meditating, how interesting would that be? However, When she thought about her habit of sleeping at night and not being able to wake her up, she couldn't help but feel depressed. The disciples of the Misty School didn't need to practice martial arts early or late, but Zhang Xiaohua couldn't. He didn't know any internal strength and could only find a place to practice martial arts. Moreover, he was afraid of being seen by others. Every time he arrived at a place, the first thing he did after dinner was to find a slightly hidden place to practice his martial arts. And ever since Zhang Xiaohua got the toy sword, his swordsmanship improved. He knew the 16 changes in his mind, and as soon as he thought about it, he could use them at will. Moreover, the angle and speed of his swordsmanship became faster and faster. The small sword was as nimble as his own arm, and the warm current was much thicker. The power also exceeded Zhang Xiaohua's expectations. Ever since one time when he practiced his swordsmanship in the suburbs, Zhang Xiaohua didn't use his full strength to stab anything. He was afraid that if he knocked down the tree, people would ask him for compensation. However, Zhang Xiaohua's worries quickly disappeared. The road to the south wasn't all official roads. After a few days, they started to take some dirt roads and mountain paths. Moreover, they didn't always stay at the town's inns at night. Sometimes, they set up their own tents and slept in the wild. On this day, Shernyo was the first to drive the carriage. The group of people arrived at a mountain. The mountain was not very high, but there was only a small path for the carriage to move forward. It meandered around the mountain. There were many shrubs and dried-up trees on the mountain. At a glance, nothing could be seen clearly. Shernyo drove the carriage to a stop. He turned around and asked, "Miss Chiotong, how did you get here last time? This mountain is very dangerous. If there's an ambush, we'll definitely be at a disadvantage." Chiotong looked at the mountain and frowned. "Last time, we passed through the mountain. There wasn't any danger. It seems that there's a path from the foot of the mountain. However, it's a long detour. I asked the guide before, and he said that it would take an extra day. Last time, I was in a hurry, so I didn't take the detour." Aunt Sheen thought for a moment, then said, "This time, the village lord is in the carriage. It's better not to take any risks. Look at the mountain. If there's a big rock falling down, no matter how high your martial arts are, it's useless. It's better to take a detour." Oyen didn't quite agree. She felt that it wasn't worth it to take a detour for safety. However, Aunt Sheen said, "It's only an extra day's journey. It's not a matter of days to reach Rejuvenation Valley. Also, your seed won't germinate in winter. Why should we take a risk for an insignificant day?" Everyone in the carriage agreed. Fortunately, Oyen was also a person who readily accepted good advice. She didn't stubbornly insist on her views. Seeing that everyone was persuading her, she also agreed to take a detour. When the carriage had gone far along the small path in front of the mountain, several men in black appeared from the forest. Looking at the carriage that was getting further and further away, they made a hand signal. Then, they all used their qinggong and leaped up the mountain. The people in the carriage didn't know that they had avoided a disaster because of their caution. They continued to move forward. The next day, they went around the mountain and re-entered the planned route. The following journey was still not on the official road. They continued to pass through the mountains and forests. However, it wasn't as dangerous as this time. However, Shernyo, Aunt Sheen, and the other disciples were extremely careful, afraid that something unexpected would happen. However, the heavens didn't let them. On this day, they were in front of a forest. Although there was a saying in the Jianghu, "Don't enter a forest," looking at the forest in front of them, there weren't many trees. Most of the leaves had fallen off. The cold wind blew, making a whistling sound. It didn't seem to be dangerous, so everyone let down their guard. Just as Shernyo was singing a ballad and driving the carriage into the forest, a sound was heard. A whistling arrow was shot out from the forest and nailed to the ground about 10 zhang in front of the carriage. The sudden arrow interrupted Shernyo's song. He immediately sucked in a breath of cold air. With a sound, he forcefully pulled on the horse's reins and stopped the carriage. Everyone in the carriage was chatting, so they all stopped talking. Even Zhang Xiaohua and the others in the carriage behind them were startled by this sudden situation. Many disciples were also stunned. They immediately took out their weapons and jumped out of the carriage, preparing to fight. Just as everyone was feeling nervous, a man came out of the forest on a horse. He was tall and was dressed very simply. He held a spear in his hand. The horse he sat on was not very handsome. It was only moving forward slowly with a dee-da-dee-dee sound. When he got closer, everyone could see clearly that the man had a square face. His face was thin, but his eyes were very lively. His eyes were staring at the 4 carriages that were spinning around. When he reached the whistling arrow, he stopped and held the spear with both hands. Everyone was shocked and thought, could it be that this person came to challenge us alone? They couldn't help but tighten their grip on their weapons. However, after a while, they still didn't see that person urging his horse. Just as they were puzzled, they heard that person shout. His voice was even louder than Chernio's. He shouted, "This mountain was opened by me. These trees were planted by me. If you want to pass by, you have to pay the toll." His voice was extremely loud and clear. It was so loud that some birds in the forest flew away. However, the people in the carriages looked at this person and laughed in their hearts. It was as if they were watching a joke. They didn't answer. When that person saw that the other party didn't respond to his shout, and that the driver of the carriage didn't have any expression on his face, he coldly stared at him. He couldn't help but become angry. "What are you looking at? Were you the one who sang just now? What kind of nonsense are you spouting? You are dirtying my ears for no reason at all. Hurry up and hand over the money, and I'll let you pass. Otherwise..." At this point, the spear in his hand swayed in the air threateningly. The stone ox wanted to see what kind of skills this robber had, but when he heard him say that his singing was bad, it was simply exposing his reverse scale. The stone ox was furious. He jumped down from the carriage and walked toward the robber with his bare hands. The robber saw the coachman jump down from the carriage and walk toward him. He was stunned. When the stone ox got closer, he raised his spear and pulled the reins of his horse. Everyone in Huanshi Manor thought that he was going to drive his horse forward and stab Chernio with his spear. Although everyone knew that Chernio's external martial arts were at the peak of perfection, they were still worried for him when he faced a spear with his bare hands. However, that person pulled the reins. He didn't rush forward. Instead, he turned his horse and drove it back. Not only Chernio, but the crowd was also in an uproar. What was he doing? While everyone was in a daze, that person returned to the forest and disappeared in a flash. Stone Ox frowned. Just as he was about to turn around, he heard the sound of a gong in the forest. 4 large horses rushed out from the forest. Behind the horses were a dozen or so men wielding weapons. They followed the horses as they galloped out. The people on the horses stopped in front of the stone cow. There were 4 people in a row. Other than the weak-looking scholar at the side, the other 3 were burly men. They were dressed in martial attire, and each of them held a sword in their hands. They stood on the horses and did not speak. The scholar urged his horse forward and said, "Where did you come from? You actually have guts. You can still keep calm in front of Nyo Air. You must also be a martial artist." Chernio frowned and said, "Why do you care where I come from? If you know what's good for you, quickly get out of the way and let us pass. Otherwise, don't blame us for being impolite." The scholar hadn't laughed yet. The group of strong men who surrounded them first roared with laughter. It seemed that they had never seen such an arrogant robber. The scholar said again, "This brother. I see that you are tall and have an imposing appearance. You must be a martial artist and have some unique skills. But didn't you see the opponents in front of you? These are the 3 leaders of our families, and there are more than 10 brothers. Even if you have strong martial arts skills and a body made of steel, how many nails can you twist? Why don't you leave the gold and silver early? Everyone will have a face, and it will be easier to meet in the future." Chernio laughed out loud and said, "Your grandpa sure has always been the one to rob other people's masters. It's not other people's turn to be noisy in front of me. If you provoke me, I will directly break into your nest and take your gold and silver." At this time, the man on the horse frowned and said, "Military advisor, why are you being long-winded with him? We will swarm him. Why are we afraid of his martial arts? Let's rob the carriage first. If there is money, we will rob. If there is a woman, we will rob. Isn't it fun?" The people of Huanshi Mountain Manor originally had some people outside the carriage and some people inside. They were all watching the fun. When they heard the leader's words, They felt that it was insulting the manor lord and the others. They couldn't help but be angry. They all took their weapons and jumped off the carriage. Except for a few female disciples guarding around the carriage, everyone else lined up behind Shernyo. He Tianshu whispered to Zhang Xiaohua. He also took out his long sword and guarded beside Yan's carriage. Zhang Xiaohua didn't get off the carriage. She went to the front of the carriage and sat with the disciple driving the carriage. She watched the scene with interest. When the military advisor saw the military advisor change his expression, he changed his expression and changed his expression. Then, he said to the leader with a smile, "Don't be angry. The Jianghu today is not the same as before. The barbaric killing has passed. Now we talk about gentleness and using martial arts to convince people. Although we rob the poor and give to the rich, we have to follow the trend of the times and keep pace with the times. Otherwise, we will be ridiculed by our peers. As the ancient people said, it is better to lose 10 taels of silver than to lose an inch of face. Even if we can't win this time, we have to be ambitious, thoughtful, and ambitious strong men." One of the leaders at the side spat and said, "I used to rob as much as I wanted, but what happened to me now? You still want to talk about gentleness? Do you want to see others talk to you? You all have weapons. Why don't you do it?" The leader said, "Second brother, don't be impatient. Now we talk about group and scale. If we don't have a reputation, who will come to join us? If we don't do it ourselves, won't we be swallowed by others in the end?" I think what the military advisor said is reasonable. If we can't convince people with martial arts, it's not too late for us to do it. Either way, we will use weapons. It's a different soup, but not the same medicine. The strong men's words were not hidden from the people of Huan Shi Mountain Villa. Everyone was stunned and didn't know what to do. Were they robbers or preachers? At this time, the military advisor urged the horse forward and shouted to the stone ox, "Brother, as you can see, we are not unscrupulous people, but we have to do the duty of enforcing justice on behalf of heaven. We have to do this. We can negotiate and let you go after you take the gold and silver. Look at your attitude. You don't seem to be happy. Fortunately, you're lucky to have met us. I'm not that talented, but I've just returned from overseas last year. I've learned a new type of robbery from overseas, and I want to show my ambition here. Since you've come to my territory, I'm the one who makes the decision. If you pass, our leader is a gentleman and will definitely let you pass. But if you lose, don't blame us for being rude. Leave behind the gold, silver, and beauties. What do you think?" Everyone understood what he said, but they didn't know how to answer. Usually, when they encountered robbers, they just fought with their weapons. Now, this overseas returnee was talking about rules, which made everyone feel uneasy. At this time, Yen, who didn't show up in the carriage, stretched out her hand and waved to a female disciple outside the carriage. The disciple looked over, and after Yen said a few words, the female disciple walked to the stone ox and whispered in his ear. The stone ox frowned and said to the group of experts, "Fine, my master said to let you come. We'll take you all. Let's see if you're sent out by the government or if you're smuggled out." The military advisor was overjoyed and said, "That's good. Let's fight peacefully. Don't shed blood." Alas, there are still some people in Jianghu who want to see blood. It's not good. Even if they can't hurt people, it's not good to hurt flowers and plants. It's inevitable to destroy the ecological environment. Oh, let's not talk too much. We have our own rules in our territory. Do you see the 3 heroes in front of you? These are the 3 tests. If 3 of you fight against 3 of our leaders, you will pass if you win 2 rounds. If you lose 2 rounds, you will have to leave behind 4 carriages and a group of women. What do you think?" When the people in the villa heard this, they all slapped their foreheads. Oh my God, after talking for so long, wasn't it just 3 battles? Luckily, they were overseas returnees. If they weren't smuggled out, then they must be from some random sect. They were so long-winded. However, to be able to rob people to such a level, it was amazing. Of course, the stone ox didn't dare to agree casually. He quickly walked to the front of the carriage. Yen glanced at him. This strong man knew how to calculate. Including He Tianshu, there were 3 people. Even if there was one more, it wouldn't be easy to get together. However, the stone ox didn't want to. He said, "Villa Lord, I can handle this group of brats alone. Why do we have to go through so much trouble? Aunt Sheen smiled and said, we've been out for so long and feel so bored. We only know how to travel all day. Now that there's a ready-made fun of us, why don't we enjoy it? I haven't seen such interesting bandits in so many years. The Stone Ox was originally an unromantic person. Hearing the villa lord and Aunt Sheen's words, he couldn't be bothered with them. He returned to the front and said, all right, my master agrees. However, we still have a question. What if we win? What will you do? The military advisor smiled embarrassedly and said, we didn't think about that. But I'm the master of my territory. I set the rules. If you win, I'll let you pass through my territory. That should be fine, right? The Stone Ox was too lazy to say more. He waved his hand and said, 3 battles at the same time or one at a time? The military advisor rolled his eyes and said, naturally, it's better to start at the same time. Time is money. The earlier you finish, the earlier you can rest. That way, you can go earlier. What do you think? The Stone Ox was about to agree when a voice like an oriole came from the carriage. That's not right. When the strong men heard this, their eyes couldn't help but light up. They stared at the carriage, waiting for the beautiful woman to appear. Unfortunately, when Aunt Sheen appeared, everyone's heads drooped. They were filled with endless melancholy. Her voice was so beautiful, but why was she so ordinary? Aunt Sheen stood at the front of the carriage and said, if all 3 battles are held at the same time, won't they be split into 3 places? If your subordinates don't keep their promise and attack together, won't our carriage be in danger? We suggest that we compete one at a time. This chapter was written very reluctantly. It was written very slowly. It's stuck. Please collect it. Thank you. 0. Chapter 123. The strategist didn't seem embarrassed at having his scheme exposed. He only shook his head and said, sigh, you really can't talk to a summer bug. Time is so precious and you guys are wasting it. You even look down on our character. You're looking down on the new generation of mountain kings. Forget it. Since you came from afar to deliver supplies, we'll just put up with it. We'll listen to you this time. Afterwards, Joma came to the head commander's side and whispered in his ear for a while. The head commander nodded. Only then did the military advisor speak again. Since it's decided, who will you send for the first round? Is it this big guy? The Stone Ox glared angrily and raised its head to walk forward. However, it was stopped by Aunt Sheen. The Stone Ox walked back to the carriage in confusion. Oyen said, Stone Ox, don't be angry. We're just having fun. Is there anyone among the mountain bandits who can beat you and Aunt Sheen? However, I'm afraid they'll use tricks. It's better to let He Tianshu go first. The Stone Ox was startled. He Tianshu? Can he do it? Aunt Sheen smiled. Although He Tianshu isn't a high-ranking disciple, he's still a team leader. He's much stronger than the other disciples. He's just right to go. There aren't many in this wilderness who can beat him. Even if he loses, we don't have to worry. Don't we still have you? Let's see if these 3 people are your match. The Stone Ox didn't have many ideas in this regard. You guys are the ones making the decisions. If you say it's okay, then it's okay. Afterwards, Aunt Sheen called He Tianshu to the front of the carriage and also gave him some instructions. He Tianshu was somewhat prepared to let himself go. Among all the people in the manor, he was now ranked 3rd. His little vanity was temporarily satisfied. When He Tianshu came to the front of the formation, he said to the strategist on the horse, my surname is He. I'm here to ask for advice. Who will dismount? The strategist looked He Tianshu up and down and smiled. This person in front of us has an imposing appearance. He must be an expert. We'll treat him seriously. Please wait a moment. Then, he cupped his hands to the person beside him and said, Second leader, please show them your strength. The second leader didn't say anything. He took out his sword and got off the horse. He walked in front of He Tianshu and took up a stance, please. He Tianshu saw that they were ready to fight and didn't hold back. He formed a sword sign and thrust it into the opponent's stance. Thus, the 2 of them exchanged moves. Although He Tianshu was very cautious when he attacked, he was actually somewhat contemptuous in his heart. As a disciple of the ethereal sect, he had always been a proud person. Although he was not a core disciple of the sect, he had always been very confident and did not think that this robber would be a match for him. However, after a few moves, he discovered that the man was not as weak as he had imagined. The man's attack and defense were good, and he was able to fight with ease. He Tianshu could not help but immediately restrain his thoughts and treat the man seriously. His sword moves were shwa shwa, one move after another, and he attacked the second head non-stop. When the second head saw the changes in He Tianshu's moves, he also revealed a smile at the corner of his mouth. He actually used offense as defense, and He Tianshu did not have the slightest advantage. The people of Huanxi Manor were in the same mood as He Tianshu at first, but when they saw that He Tianshu didn't gain the upper hand, they were shocked. When they carefully looked at the man's sword skills, they were even more surprised. Yin frowned and said to Aunt Qin, when did such an expert appear in the wilderness? Could it be that in a few days, the martial arts in Jianghu have improved so much? Our Misty School's disciples can't even take down a robber. Did the sun rise from the west? Aunt Qin was also confused and said, Manor Lord is wise. It's really like this. Looking at the situation, this man isn't any weaker than He Tianshu. How can someone with such skills become a bandit? It's really strange. The layman watched the show while the expert watched the skill. Everyone was worried, but only Zhang Xiaohua was puzzled. Why? Ever since He Tianshu started fighting with the man, Zhang Xiaohua couldn't stop muttering in her heart, what's this captain he doing? Why is he playing with him? Didn't he use the third variation of the sword move that Elder Yu taught him? Didn't he just stab him from the side? There's also this move. He already swung his sword forward and used the 10th variation of the sword move. Didn't he just stab into the man's chest and injure him with one strike? Damn, there's also this move? Using the first variation is so simple. I think Captain he is just playing with him. Actually, Zhang Xiaohua was only an armchair strategist. She only knew what to do after watching from the side. If she really went up to meet the enemy, she wouldn't know what to do when the other party swung his sword, let alone think of a move. Moreover, the onlooker saw more clearly. Being in the middle of a battle, one's life was always in danger. How would one have the time to observe other people's thoughts? Of course, Zhang Xiaohua could see this. More importantly, the variation of the sword move that Elder Yu taught her was indeed a top-notch move. It was something that the other party used to protect his life. Just as Zhang Xiaohua was cursing in her heart, there was a new change in the battle. He Tianshu couldn't help but feel annoyed when he saw that he couldn't win after attacking for a long time. His face seemed to be a little noisy. He moved his body and displayed another secret sword move from the Misty School. The moment he used this move, the second in charge couldn't help but feel a little pressured. He blocked left and right and actually retreated step by step. However, after retreating for a while, he changed his sword move and changed his style. He changed his sword move and moved around like He Tianshu at the beginning. The momentum of his sword move was also a little strange. Not long after, he regained control of the situation. The two of them fought like this for a long time, but there was still no winner. The people in Huanxi Manor were a little relieved. Only Yin and Aunt Qin were puzzled. They didn't know who the thief was. At this time, the military advisor at the side said, Stop, stop. When the second in charge heard this, he used his padao to knock He Tianshu's sword. Then, he moved out of the circle and silently looked at the military advisor. He Tianshu saw that the second in charge left and didn't chase after him. He only took a defensive stance and carefully took precautions. He was afraid of any tricks. That military counselor loudly said, This brother's martial arts skill is actually so high that he is able to be on par with our second master. This is really unexpected. However, the two of you are evenly matched. If you continue to fight, it will inevitably take a lot of time. Why don't we call this a draw? He Tianshu didn't understand and turned to look at Aunt Qin. Aunt Qin was at the side and naturally saw it clearly. That person was indeed not inferior to He Tianshu. Suggesting a draw was beneficial to her. Thus, she also said loudly, All right, the military advisor is a straightforward person. Then it's settled. After a short rest, we will prepare for the second round. He Tianshu put away his sword and walked back to the carriage. The second in charge also got on his horse and returned to their side. Aunt Qin waited for He Tianshu to come closer and quietly asked, Captain He, what do you think of the opponent's skills? He Tianshu blushed slightly and said, this person is very strong. After fighting with me for so long, he still looked like he wanted to continue. Perhaps he still has some tricks up his sleeve. Where did this expert come from? It's really hard to understand. Hallmaster Qin, this one has let everyone down and didn't win this round. I am ashamed. Aunt Qin smiled and said, Captain He, you don't need to mind. This is just a pastime. It's good that you came back without any mishap. There is always a mountain higher than the one before. There will always be experts in Jianghu. Captain He, you don't need to belittle yourself. After a while, the military advisor shouted again, on the other side, have you finished your discussion? How about we start the second round now? Aunt Qin looked at the stone ox and said, are you going up or should I? Before the stone ox could reply, O Yin said from the side, Stone ox, you go up. Aunt Qin doesn't like to gamble in front of others. If you win, we will have victory in our hands. At worst, it will be a draw. We will give up on the third round and see what these experts plan to do. The stone ox nodded and steadily walked forward. The military advisor looked at the stone ox and smiled quietly. He said to the first in charge, it's up to you now. Let them see your heroic fighting style. The first in charge chuckled and also dismounted from his horse. He held his sword and walked towards the stone ox. When he got close, although the first in charge wasn't short, he was still half a head shorter than the stone ox. He slightly raised his head and looked at the stone ox's silent eyes. He smiled and said, this brother, what is your name? Can you let me know? The stone ox shook his head and didn't say anything. The first in charge didn't force him and said, then, this brother, please make your move. You don't need a weapon? When the stone ox heard this, he still shook his head and said, my fist is a weapon. You just have to be careful. The first in charge narrowed his eyes and said, if that's the case, then I won't be polite. When he finished speaking, he held his sword and chopped down. The stone ox saw the ferocious power of the sword and wasn't afraid. He slightly tilted his body and dodged the blade. He punched the back of the sword. How could the first in charge let him have his way? He twisted his wrist and changed his stance. The blade sliced towards the stone ox's wrist. Although the stone ox was careless, it didn't mean he was stupid. Although his mighty King Kong hand wasn't afraid of weapons, who knew if his opponent's sword was a rare divine weapon? If he was injured because of carelessness, then he wouldn't be able to live up to his decades of experience. The stone ox quickly changed his stance and dodged the blade. He sent a palm towards the first in charge's chest. The first in charge couldn't dodge in time. He clenched his left hand and punched towards the stone ox's palm. Thus, after a few rounds, the two people's fists and palms collided. It was a simple collision of fists and palms, but the result was out of everyone's expectations. The first in charge's fist hit the stone ox's palm. Just like Zhang Xiaohua and Yu Dei that day, the stone ox flew out diagonally. When his body was in the air, he spat out a mouthful of blood. The first in charge didn't faint on the spot like Zhang Xiaohua. Instead, he quickly walked to his horse, picked up the stirrups and got on the horse. He waved his hand at the military counselor. The military counselor shouted, retreat. Then, the second in charge and the third in charge who didn't make a move, as well as the rest of the people, scattered and ran towards the woods. They were as fast as the ebbing tide and disappeared in the blink of an eye. The people of the Huanxi Mountain Villa looked at each other in dismay, not knowing what to do. They all looked at the open space in front of them. A moment ago, there were many ferocious experts who wanted to rob them and even proposed 3 rounds of competition. Now, there was not a single person. It was as if nothing had happened at all. After a while, everyone cheered in unison as if they had really gone through a life and death duel. The stone ox wasn't too proud. He raised his palm and looked it up and down. Then, he turned around and walked back. There was no expression on his face, as if he didn't care about his victory. When the stone ox returned to the carriage, Aunt Qin asked with concern, Stone ox, that person didn't use any tricks, right? The stone ox shook his head and said, no. But looking at this person's bladesmanship, it doesn't seem simple. Why is his internal energy so weak? Although my mighty King Kong palm is powerful and can injure muscles and break bones, if he has profound internal energy, he should be able to resist it. Looking at his appearance, he didn't learn any profound internal energy cultivation method. It should be an extremely common cultivation method in Jianghu. Aunt Chi nodded and said, I reckon that this first master's martial arts are about the same as the second master's. That second master was able to fight evenly with He Tianshu, but compared to you, he's definitely much weaker. It's possible that he was sent flying with a palm strike. However, I still feel that this group of bandits is very strange. They set up a best out of 3 match, but ended up with a weak finish. It's rather strange. Chiotong said in a low voice, maybe they saw Brother Shi's martial arts and knew that they were no match for him. That's why they ran away in fear. Who knows? Oyen smiled and said, it's probably like what Chiotong said. You guys have been in Jianghu for a long time and are used to thinking on a deeper level. Many things, perhaps from a simple point of view. This is a group of bandits who thought themselves clever. They first used the empty fort strategy to scare us. Then, a group of people came out to see our reaction. If we retreated, they would probably swarm us. But when they saw that we were prepared to fight back, they set up a trick and challenged us. When they saw our strength, they immediately ran away like a stray dog. When everyone heard this, they understood and agreed in unison. Although Aunt Sheen still had some doubts, the crisis had passed. There was no point in saying more, so she closed her mouth. Although the strong people had retreated, they still had to pass through the forest. In order to prevent an ambush in the forest, He Tianshu and a few disciples used their lightness skills to explore the forest. Although the forest wasn't big, it wasn't small either. After the time it took to drink a cup of tea, they returned safely. The forest was empty, without a trace of a person. Thus, everyone packed up again. The group of disciples got off the carriage and walked on foot with weapons in hand. But when the carriage slowly passed through the forest, they didn't see any ambush. Only then did they believe that the group of bandits had really run away. Then, everyone got on the carriage and sped away. In a valley not far from the forest, the group of bandits got off their horses and sat cross-legged on the grass. The military advisor smiled and said to the big boss, Old Zhao, how's my acting as a military advisor? Old Zhao smiled and said, very good. You're worthy of being called a genius. This skill is something that we can't learn. Unlike Old Hong, who has the face of a dead man and doesn't dare to say anything for fear of giving the game away. The third boss said unhappily, I'm not here to act. I'm fine with fighting and killing, but it's hard for me to get into character as a bandit. Since you guys insist on making me do it, then I can only keep quiet. The second boss said, this Misty School's disciples are really good. The one who fought with me just now is surnamed He, right? He's a nobody, but he actually has good swordsmanship. He almost forced me to use my ultimate move. Luckily, Chi Shotsai stopped me in time and didn't give the game away. Chi Shotsai said, I knew it. Brother Ma won't admit defeat. We agreed beforehand to find out their strength, so it doesn't matter if we lose. Brother Ma, why take it so seriously? But Old Zhao, is that stone cow really so powerful that he could make you vomit blood with one palm? Old Zhao looked at their concern and smiled mysteriously, saying, if you guys really think that I was injured by that stone cow, then our act will be extremely successful. According to reliable information, this stone cow has the highest martial arts in their group. If he really used his full strength, he might not be able to win within 100 moves. However, if he wants to make me vomit blood with one palm, then he must be dreaming. I just bit my tongue a little and spit out a little bit of blood, that's all. Everyone suddenly understood and gave him a thumbs up. Then, Chi Shotsai said, other than Stone Cow who has the highest martial arts in this group, we already know that. Next is Aunt Sheen. We already know her martial arts. However, according to our information, she has been diligent in her studies these past few years, so there shouldn't be too many discrepancies. Old Zhao narrowed his eyes and said, our Lord has said that we don't need to test her too much. This woman has always been cunning, so I'm afraid that she might see through something. Her martial arts have improved, but it's still not as good as Stone Cow's. Don't worry. However, this extra surnamed He is troublesome. Although his martial arts aren't that high, he can still tie down one of our experts. In this way, We don't have enough people. The other disciples are probably the same, so our subordinates should be able to handle them. Chishotsai, what do you think? Should we wait for our Lord to send more people over? Or, Chishotsai smiled and said, you don't have to worry about this. Our Lord has his own plans. Our operation must be foolproof and must succeed in one strike. No one can escape. Otherwise, if Opang from the Misty School finds out about this, it will be no small matter. Actually, their strength is only at this level. Our Lord has 10,000 ways to deal with them, but in order to not reveal any flaws, he is being careful. Everyone, rest up and wait for our Lord's next plan. Everyone sat up quietly without saying a word. Chishotsai walked to a secluded area and took out a pen and paper. He wrote something on a slip of paper, then called a man in embroidered clothes and gave him the slip of paper. He then whispered something into his ear before letting him go. The man in embroidered clothes untied the reins from the tree and mounted his horse. He galloped in a certain direction and disappeared in the blink of an eye. It was obvious that the horse he rode was very handsome. Please add it to your collection. Thank you. 0. Chapter 124. How could the people in Huanxi Mountain Manor know what was happening in the distance? They were talking about what had just happened in high spirits. Thinking about Stone Ox's power, they were deeply envious. Many of them secretly made up their minds to work harder when they returned to the sect and strive to have such a powerful moment in the future. Only the stone cow was still the same as before. He steadily drove the carriage forward, as if he did not have the consciousness of being treated as an idol. Fortunately, he had just gone through a so-called great battle, so he was not in the mood to sing his best songs. Otherwise, the image that he had just established in everyone's hearts might immediately collapse. Of course, not everyone in the manor was in high spirits or calm as water. The only one who was not happy was He Tianshu. He Tianshu could not be said to be particularly outstanding among the disciples of Misty School, but he was still considered one of the best. Although he had been sent to Huanxi Mountain Manor to manage the herbal field, his martial arts were still there. Otherwise, how could he have become the team leader? He originally knew that there was a gap between him and Stone Ox, but he did not know how big the gap was. Now, it seemed that he had fought with Stone Ox for a long time and still had some strength left. Stone Ox, on the other hand, had fought with Stone Ox for a long time and sent him flying with only one palm, injuring him and causing him to vomit blood. Now it seemed that the gap between him and Stone Ox was not small. It seemed that he had been too arrogant in the past. In the future, he still had a long way to go. Among them, there was one person who was not very similar to the others. He was the simple-minded Zhang Xiaohua. He did not learn martial arts systematically, so naturally, he did not know the difficulties, especially when he saw Stone Ox send the strong man flying with one palm. He seemed to be reminded of his previous experience and immediately lost interest. Therefore, when the others were discussing, he had already picked up a book silently and was reading by himself. He did not even notice He Tianshu's self-deprecation. The robbery incident was like a wave in the river, disappearing in a flash. Soon, it became a joke after a meal. Even in the next town, when the Misty School's disciples came to pick them up, it was only mentioned as a pastime. However, Landong, a disciple of the Misty School in this small town, was a careful person. After listening to it, he felt that something was not right. It was normal that the people of Huanxi Villa did not know about it. After all, they were from other places. He had been operating here for several years, so why hadn't he heard of any bandits? Moreover, it was the kind that didn't do anything ordinary. However, he could not tell these thoughts to Yin and the others. After all, they had already asserted that this was a group of stupid bandits. Moreover, such a group of bandits might have appeared when he was not paying attention. The only thing he could do was to quickly write down his thoughts on a note and report it to his leader to let them make a decision. Moreover, he also believed that once his leader saw the news about Villa Chifo, he would immediately report it to the higher-ups in the sect. He would definitely not dare to delay. After this news spread, he was slightly relieved. The next thing he had to do was to find an opportunity to explain to Villa Chifo, Stone Ox and the others so that they would be more vigilant. However, when he told Yin and the others about this situation, It was not out of his expectations. Yin and Stone Ox did not take it seriously. Only Aunt Chin frowned slightly and wanted to say something. However, when she saw Yin's determined gaze, she closed her mouth. She knew that Yin wanted to go to Rejuvenation Valley wholeheartedly. At this time, she would not believe anything she said. However, speaking of which, who would know that Yin had gone to Rejuvenation Valley? Even if someone knew, what reason did they have to stop her? Could it be that they had nothing better to do? When Landong saw that his words did not attract any attention, he did not say anything more. However, when Yin left, he proposed to send a disciple to escort her. However, he was also rejected. This was because there were not many disciples from the Misty School in the small town, and their martial arts were at the standard of an ordinary disciple. Only this Landong was like Tianshu. However, he could not leave the small town for a long time. Unless it was meaningful for him to escort, the others would do their best. On the other hand, Yin used the reason that she did not want to affect the daily operations of the Misty School and rejected Landong's good intentions. Thus, the group of people once again drove the carriage forward. As for Landong, he returned to the small town and continued with his daily business. It was not until the second night after Yin and the others left that there was news from the Misty School. When Landong opened the note sent by the carrier pigeon, his expression could not help but change greatly. On it was written, "Misty Mountain Villa has already sent an elder to provide support." When they received the news, they immediately sent out all their forces to protect the villa chief. Along the way, the Misty School's forces will prioritize the villa chief's safety. Landong could not help but complain in his heart. It had already been 2.5 days since Yin and the others left. Who knew what had happened? He hurriedly wrote down the situation briefly and released the carrier pigeon to pass the news to the disciples of the Misty School in the next small town. However, this place was no longer within the Misty School's sphere of influence. The Misty School's manpower was very spread out, and the other small towns were not very far from here. Whether they could make it in time was still a problem. He could only send the news first. After finishing these matters, Landong immediately gathered all the disciples of the Misty School in the small town. They rode their horses and followed the path that Yin and the others had taken. After bidding farewell to Landong and the rest of the ethereal sect's disciples, Yin and the rest continued to follow the route they had planned and continued to move forward without stopping. However, after the farce of the robbery, they had become even more vigilant. When they came across some suspicious places, they would first send people to investigate before passing through. Just like this, a few days passed and no more accidents occurred. Hence, the anxious hearts of the group gradually relaxed. Actually, to them, the robberies and killings in the pugilistic world were really nothing. Stone Cow and Aunt Chin, which one of them had not walked through a rain of blood. However, it was obvious that they did not have enough manpower this time, and they still had to protect Yin. Thus, they had to think twice before they acted and did not dare to make any mistakes. They traveled like this for another 3 days. On this evening, the sun was setting in the west and the evening mist was heavy. Seeing that they had arrived at a place in the middle of nowhere and looking at the map, they were still far from the next town. Presumably, they would have to sleep in the wild tonight. Thus, Aunt Chin hurriedly ordered Stone Cow to walk all the way and find a place to rest. When the sky gradually darkened, the carriage finally arrived at the side of a small river. There was a spacious open space by the river, and it was just nice to set up a tent. Thus, everyone stopped the carriage and took everything from the carriage, preparing to sleep here for the night. Although setting up the camp, burying the pot, and other matters did not have much to do with Zhang Xiaohua, but during this period of time, Zhang Xiaohua was very harmonious with everyone. How could she not help? Not to mention other things, Zhang Xiaohua had a lot of strength. She helped the male and female disciples carry things, set up the tent, and so on. She was so busy that everyone liked this diligent child even more. By the time everyone was done, the sky was already completely dark. Everyone had their own tasks. A group of male disciples went to guard the surroundings while the female disciples and some people from the mountain villa lived and cooked. Only Zhang Xiaohua was left with nothing to do. Zhang Xiaohua saw that it was still early for dinner, so she looked around. She saw a dark patch not far away. It seemed to be a small forest. Her heart skipped a beat. Why not use this time to pick up some firewood in the forest and finish today's homework together? Thinking about this, Zhang Xiaohua stood up and prepared to walk out. After taking a few steps, she heard someone calling her. She turned around and saw that it was Qiu Tong. O Yin and Aunt Qin were beside her. Zhang Xiaohua hurriedly stopped and bowed to them with a smile. After greeting them separately, Qiu Tong asked, "Zhang Xiaohua, are you going out?" Zhang Xiaohua smiled and said, "I saw that it was still early for dinner, so I wanted to go to the forest over there to pick up some firewood. It'll be useful in the evening." Qiu Tong said, "What a good child. You even know how to pick up firewood." Zhang Xiaohua quickly said modestly, "It's nothing, Sister Qiu Tong. I often do this at home." At this time, Oyin asked, "After picking up the firewood, do you still need to practice martial arts?" Zhang Xiaohua was stunned and asked, "Sister O, how did you know?" Oyin smiled and said, "You went out to find a place to practice martial arts every morning and night. How could you hide it from our eyes and ears? However, Zhang Xiaohua, you've really exceeded our expectations. You're very diligent. Also, I heard from He Tianshu that you read books every day. You've already read a lot of the books I borrowed from you." Zhang Xiaohua's face was a little red. She said embarrassedly, "Sister O, I didn't have a choice. I only learned a few scattered fist techniques. I was afraid that I wouldn't be able to practice them well, so I could only practice them secretly. That sword technique was also taught by Elder Yu. He didn't want others to know about it. I was also afraid that I would forget, so I could only avoid others." Oyin giggled and said, "I don't mean to blame you. I just admire your diligence. Naturally, I know a thing or two about Elder Yu's sword technique. You can practice as much as you want. Actually, other people didn't really peek at you. Seeing that you're so focused on martial arts, when this matter is over, I'll talk to my brother and see if you have a good opportunity." Who was Oyan's brother? He was the leader of the Misty School. A casual word from him could fulfill Zhang Xiaohua's dream. At this time, Zhang Xiaohua couldn't believe her ears and was stunned. Qiu Tong saw Zhang Xiaohua's silly look and said softly, "Zhang Xiaohua, why aren't you thanking the young miss?" Zhang Xiaohua seemed to have woken up from a dream. Her face was filled with excitement as she said happily, "Thank you, Sister O. If I have a chance, I'll definitely practice martial arts well." Oyin said, "Zhang Xiaohua, don't be happy too early. I'm just saying, whether it'll work or not, it's still up to you." Zhang Xiaohua said, "It's fine as long as there's a chance. Sister O, I'll definitely fight for it. Oh, right, there's one more thing. I don't know if I should say it." Oyin asked curiously, "What is it? Speak." Zhang Xiaohua said embarrassedly, Captain, he also wants to read the book you lent me. Is that okay?" Oyin was happy and said, "It's fine. He Tianshu isn't an outsider. If someone from the pharmacy wants to learn about botany, it's fine as long as he doesn't teach it to anyone else. Oh, right, don't damage my book. Otherwise, I won't let him read it." Zhang Xiaohua was relieved. Ever since He Tianshu had given him the small sword, he had been looking for an opportunity to tell Oyin about He Tianshu's book reading. However, along the way, there had not been any good opportunities. Today, he had finally finished his thoughts. He could not help but feel relieved. After all, he had received a gift from someone, and his mouth was bound to be tied. At this time, a pleasant voice sounded, "Zhang Xiaohua, how's your right hand recovering? Can you hold a sword?" Zhang Xiaohua looked gratefully at Aunt Qin and said, "Big Sister Qin, thank you for your concern. It's fine. It's recovering very quickly. I can hold a sword now, but it's still not flexible enough." Aunt Qin said, "Not flexible enough fingers is a big flaw in practicing the sword. You have to practice well. Also, you have to pay attention to moderation. Don't overwork yourself. It's not good if you hurt your fingers." Zhang Xiaohua smiled and said, "I know. I've been doing recovery exercises. When I feel pain, I'll immediately stop." The four of them chatted for a while before Zhang Xiaohua said goodbye and left. However, after taking a few steps, Oyin reminded her again, "Zhang Xiaohua, don't go too far. Finish practicing and come back early. There might be a storm tonight." Hearing this, Zhang Xiaohua looked up at the sky. Sure enough, the sky was gloomy. The stars that were usually as bright as pearls were nowhere to be seen. Even the full moon was nowhere to be seen. Zhang Xiaohua smiled and said, I know, big sister O. I'll come back after practicing. I'm still waiting for dinner. After speaking, she waved at the three of them and walked towards the dark place alone. When Zhang Xiaohua reached that place, she discovered that it wasn't a forest, but a small hill. He couldn't pick up firewood, but it didn't delay his practice. Thus, Zhang Xiaohua first took out his beloved small sword and practiced the sword move with ease. After many days of practice, this sword move was even more refined. It was different from the first time he used the small sword to poke a big hole in the bamboo. During this period of time, Zhang Xiaohua mainly practiced the control of the small sword's strength. Now, his control of strength was very exquisite. When the strength was high, he could easily poke a big hole in something in front of him, such as a rock or a big tree. When the strength was low, under the same speed, he could lightly tap on a big tree, leaving only a small dot. This could be considered a little trick that Zhang Xiaohua figured out himself after he practiced the sword move. Oyin was right. When Zhang Xiaohua practiced his Fist of the North Star 9 times, the familiar cold current flowed through his body and the raindrops fell pitter-patter. Since today's homework was finished, Zhang Xiaohua naturally didn't stay any longer and quickly ran back to the campsite. But when he was halfway there, he suddenly had a strange feeling and couldn't help but stop, allowing the raindrops to fall even more densely on his body. But when he calmed down and listened carefully, other than the bonfire in front of the villa, everyone's hurried footsteps and people's shouts of "It's raining, put away the clothes," there didn't seem to be any other movement. The pitter-patter of the raindrops was either dull or clear, covering up other movements in the world. The rain became heavier and heavier. Zhang Xiaohua didn't dare to stay any longer and quickly rushed back to the campsite. And on the small hill where he was practicing his fist technique, a person dressed in night clothes with a hood over his face quietly poked his head out and coldly looked at his back. Then he looked at the night sky dripping with rain and smiled with satisfaction. With a bend of his body, he used his qinggong and disappeared into the distance. Zhang Xiaohua ran into the campsite and it was chaos. The rain came too quickly, and although everyone was prepared, they were still thrown into confusion by the torrential rain. By the time everyone had finished packing up their things, the rain was already pouring down like water. Zhang Xiaohua was in the same tent as He Tianshu. By the time he entered, He Tianshu had already finished packing up and said with a smile, "You want to practice your fist technique again? You're all soaked." Then, he casually handed over a dry towel to him. Zhang Xiaohua smiled as he received it and said, "It just started to rain when I was practicing my fist technique. This rain was to help them pack up their things." Then, Zhang Xiaohua used the dry towel to wipe the rain off his head. Only then did he remember and said, "I saw the Manor Lord just now. She said that she agreed to let you read her book. However, you can't spread it out and you can't damage the book." He Tianshu said, "Then I'll have to thank you, Xiaohua." Zhang Xiaohua found it strange and said, "Isn't it the same if you tell the Manor Lord yourself? Why do you need me to say it for you? You can see her every day. I've been delayed for a few days and only saw the Manor Lord today." He Tianshu said awkwardly, "Well, you're still young so you don't really understand. After all, Manor Lord O is the Manor Lord of Huanxi Manor, and I'm a disciple of the Misty School's pharmacy hall. I'm afraid it's not appropriate to mention it rashly." Zhang Xiaohua seemed to understand and nodded. Then, he thought of something and said, "That's right. I still have to thank Captain He for putting in a good word for me in front of the Manor Lord. The Manor Lord said that when we go back, she'll find an opportunity to talk to Chief O and let me learn martial arts." "Ah, really?" He Tianshu didn't seem to believe it and asked in return, "The Manor Lord really told you that?" "Yes." Zhang Xiaohua happily nodded. He Tianshu smiled and said, "I'm just telling you the truth. You're able to gain the Manor Lord's favor. That's your chance. In the future, when you have the chance, you must properly repay the Manor Lord." Zhang Xiaohua said, "That's right. I definitely will. The Manor Lord is like an elder sister to me. I'll definitely repay her." He Tianshu said again, "However, practicing martial arts depends on luck. Your body hasn't recovered yet. Even if you practice martial arts, you might not be able to succeed. You must be mentally prepared. Moreover, there are many disciples in the Misty School who are as hardworking as you. You're just in Huanxi manner. Compared to Ma Jing and the others, you seem to be very hardworking. In the future, you have to work harder. Zhang Xiaohua's expression became serious and said, I know, Captain He. You're all very good to me. I'll definitely work hard to practice martial arts. He Tianshu smiled and walked forward. He patted his shoulder and said, When I was young, I was also as hot-blooded as you. Do well, I have high hopes for you. Then, he frowned and said, The rain is so heavy. Our camp is still near the river. There won't be any danger in the middle of the night, right? I have to go and discuss with Shernyo and the others. Zhang Xiaohua, you should rest early. While they were talking, suddenly, outside of the tent, there seemed to be a dense sound of horse hooves. He Tianshu and Zhang Xiaohua looked at each other vigilantly and walked out of the tent at the same time. 0. Chapter 125. Outside the tent, the raindrops formed a line and hung in the air. Their eyes were full of white raindrops, and they couldn't see far away. However, the sound of the horse's hooves was very orderly, shaking the ground a little. Although they couldn't see clearly, the sound had been heard and became louder and louder. Zhang Xiaohua didn't understand what was going on, but he could smell the danger. However, the experienced He Tianshu had already changed his face and shouted to Zhang Xiaohua, quickly hide in the tent and find a place to hide, or escape from the side in a moment. You don't know martial arts, so you can't do anything here. You must stay alive and report to gang leader O later. After that, he pulled out his long sword and rushed out quickly. Zhang Xiaohua was stunned on the spot. Hide? Escape? He was confused for a while. Zhang Xiaohua didn't understand the seriousness of the situation. Didn't they encounter bandits a few days ago, and they were easily defeated? Why were they so serious now? Why did they have to escape by themselves? In fact, he didn't know that when He Tianshu heard the orderly sound of the horse's hooves, he knew that this was a group trained by the military and should be targeting Oyen. Only the big gangs in Jianghu could do such a thing. Since it was a gang's robbery, they must have a strict plan and not leave the routes. Although there were many people in Huanxi Villa, no one could escape. Except for a few people who would be caught alive, the fate of the others could almost be decided now. Zhang Xiaohua was just a child and was small. In such a night, it was really possible for him to escape. On one hand, he could keep his life, and on the other hand, he could report the news to Openg. On the other hand, he couldn't let the others die in peace. Moreover, He Tianshu wanted Zhang Xiaohua to escape at that time, but the situation was unclear. If he ran away first, wouldn't it be a joke? Moreover, to be honest, the other party must have done a lot of preparation in advance. Now there might be an ambush around the camp. If he escaped at this time, it was tantamount to walking into a trap. On the contrary, he could escape in a chaotic battle later. How could Zhang Xiaohua know about He Tianshu's plan? Time was of the essence, so he naturally could not explain it in detail. If He Tianshu turned around and saw Zhang Xiaohua's dazed look, he would definitely vomit blood in anger. Zhang Xiaohua looked at the pouring rain outside and hesitated for a moment. Then, she walked into the tent and blew out the light. She carefully stood in the shadow of the tent entrance and poked her head out to observe carefully. As for He Tianshu, he rushed out of his tent in the rain and immediately used his qinggong to rush towards Oyan's tent. Although He Tianshu's tent was only a dozen steps away from Oyan's tent, He Tianshu did not dare to be negligent. When He Tianshu arrived in front of Oyan's tent, before he even got close, he heard a voice calling out, "Who is it?" He Tianshu quickly stopped and shouted, "It's me, He Nu." At this moment, the voice in the tent sounded again. "Captain He, please come in." When He Tianshu walked to the entrance of the tent's curtain was opened. He Tianshu looked up and saw Shernyo. When He Tianshu walked into the tent, he saw that there were already many people inside. Aunt Qin, Oyen, Qiu Tong, Shernyo, and a few female disciples. He Tianshu did not delay and said to Shernyo, "Senior brother, you must have heard the commotion." Shernyo's face was stiff as he nodded and did not speak. He Tianshu knew his personality and did not mind. He turned to ask Aunt Qin, "Hallmaster Qin, what should we do?" Aunt Qin said, "We'll deal with the situation as it arises. Since things have reached this point, we have been too careless. Chang'e, take a few disciples and prepare the horses. When the fight starts, mix together. Protect the manor lord and break out of the encirclement. Then, return to the town we passed by a few days ago and find Landong and the others. A female disciple in the tent agreed and took 2 people out in the rain. Then, Aunt Sheen ordered the rest of the disciples to go to their respective tents. She instructed everyone to take out their weapons and prepare for battle. At this moment, the sound of horse hooves that covered the sound of the rain stopped. He Tianshu walked out of the tent with his sword in hand. When he saw everything in front of him, he could not help but suck in a breath of cold air. Not far away, there was a row of horses. It was hard to tell how many there were in the dark, but the horses stood still in the wind and rain. They must have been trained for a long time. The people on the horses were dressed in night clothes and had black masks over their heads. It was impossible to see the origin of this group of people. At this moment, Shernyo, Aunt Sheen, and a group of male and female disciples all took out their weapons and walked out of the tent. They stood in the rain with their heads held high and faced the black-clothed people. Seeing that the people on the other side did not move, He Tianshu turned around to look at Shernyo and the others. He then circulated his internal energy and shouted, "Friends on the other side, why are you surrounding our camp? Is there a problem?" The black-clothed people on the other side still did not move. He Tianshu could not help but frown. Just as he was about to say something, the sound of hurried horse hooves came from behind the black-clothed people. It came from afar and soon arrived in front of them. The black-clothed people seemed to know that it was their helper. They all opened up a path for the horse to rush to the front. When that person arrived in front of everyone, they could only vaguely see a short, black-clothed person sitting on a majestic horse. His face was also covered by a black mask. When the horse stopped, the black-clothed person lightly snorted. It was like a needle piercing into He Tianshu's ear, causing his blood and qi to surge. He Tianshu felt that he had to circulate his internal energy to suppress the surging internal energy. He Tianshu was shocked. This kind of internal energy was top-notch in Jianghu. He did not know who this person was, but he actually wanted to kill him tonight. Open up. Thinking of this, He Tianshu held his sword and cupped his fists. He circulated his internal energy and said, "The person in front must be a senior. I don't know why you can't forget my Misty School's disciples. If I have offended you in any way, after today, I will bring a bramble and ask for punishment." The black-clothed person at this time also spoke. His voice was slightly hoarse and old. "You are only a low-ranking disciple of the Misty School. You don't have the qualifications to speak to me. There is also no need to curry favor with me. You must have seen today's situation clearly. If you know what's good for you, quickly surrender and obediently return with us. Otherwise, don't blame us for offending the heavens." Before he finished speaking, Aunt Sheen's clear voice rang out, "The scoundrel on the other side. Since you dare to sneak attack us, why don't you dare to show your true face? You dare to wander the Jianghu without daring to show your name." It was still the same old voice. He said calmly, "Aunt Sheen's voice is still as good as ever. You also lived a carefree life in the Misty School. How would you know the feeling of drifting in the Jianghu? You must have forgotten it long ago. This kind of provocation is useless. You still want to stall for time. In this wilderness, what kind of reinforcements do you have? Stop the idle chatter and surrender. Otherwise, I will give the order." After he finished speaking, that person raised his right hand. Since things had come to this point, there was naturally nothing to discuss. In fact, He Tianshu's words did have the intention of stalling for time, but he also knew that this was just a fantasy. His side only had so much strength, and looking at the formation of the black-clothed men, he was afraid that they had already figured out his situation and looked as if they had already won. Looking at the black-clothed person's arm falling bit by bit, He Tianshu didn't dare to make a decision. He turned around to look at Aunt Sheen and the stone cow. He saw Aunt Sheen and the stone cow look at each other, then both leaped up and pounced at the black-clothed person outside. Thus, He Tianshu didn't hesitate and also pounced in the other direction. As for the remaining disciples, they all roared and pounced with weapons in their hands. Only a few female disciples were left behind. They held long swords in their hands and protected Oyan's tent. When the black-clothed person saw the Misty School's group rushing out, his arms suddenly dropped and he spat out a word, "Kill." That voice actually caused everyone's hearts to tremble. The black-clothed people all swung their stirrups and dismounted. They tiptoed and went to meet the Misty School's group. In an instant, the two groups of people were standing together. Just as He Tianshu was about to charge forward, a black shadow suddenly swept past from above. With a sharp whistle, the shadow said, "Surnamed He, your opponent is me." Before the shadow finished speaking, a long sword pierced towards He Tianshu's chest like lightning. He Tianshu was shocked. He dodged with a sidestep and calmed down a little. He immediately formed a sword seal and returned the favor. The two of them attacked and defended each other. Sword light flashed. After dozens of moves, there was no clear winner. The stone ox also met an opponent halfway. That person was holding a chime cudgel. When he waved it around, it made a humming sound. The falling raindrops seemed to be blown away by him. Although the stone ox didn't have a weapon, when he used the mighty King Kong hand, it didn't seem to be inferior to that person's. His moves were wide, and he only attacked the black-clothed man's vital points. As for his own body, other than his vital points, he still had to defend himself. As for the other places, when the cudgel hit them, it only made him frown slightly. Under the stone cow's reckless attacks, the black-clothed person couldn't help but be at a disadvantage. Today, Aunt Sheen also abandoned her snake fist and took out her weapon. It was a flexible sword. Under Aunt Sheen's dancing, it was like a nimble snake coming out of its hole. Every move drew blood. In just a short moment of contact with the black-clothed people, several of them were injured. Just as Aunt Sheen was in the mood to kill, a red-tasseled spear suddenly came out from the side. Like a fierce dragon, it was aimed at her face. Aunt Sheen didn't panic. She exerted strength in her legs and flipped into the air. The spear barely pierced through her body. Aunt Sheen was in the air, and she stabbed her sword at the wrist holding the spear. The black-clothed person wasn't simple either. Seeing the spear miss and the flexible sword stabbing towards him, he squatted down slightly and dodged the sword. His left foot took the opportunity to kick upwards. It was aimed at Aunt Sheen's abdomen. Seeing that this move didn't work, Aunt Sheen immediately retracted her momentum and changed her move. Thus, the two of them started fighting. At this time, all the black-clothed people, except for the one with the old voice who came last, had already dismounted and attacked. The old man in black sat steadily on his horse. Seeing that He Tianshu, the stone cow, and Aunt Sheen were all stopped by his own people, he finally calmed down and looked at the other battles. Oyen didn't bring too many disciples with her this time. After all, they were all trained by the Misty School. Moreover, which of them were mediocre? On the other hand, although the black-robed men outnumbered those from the villa, they could not bring too many people with them when they acted in secret, so they did not have an absolute advantage in terms of numbers. Moreover, in order to avoid failure and being found out by others, these black-robed men were not disciples of that gang, so their martial arts level was inferior to that of the disciples of Huanxi Villa. Therefore, when the two sides fought, 1 or 2 or 3 black-robed men fought against a disciple of a villa, but it was still a tie. When he saw the situation in the field, the old man in black calmed down and seemed to have a card up his sleeve. In his mind, there was no need for his lord to be so cautious. He let the elites and 1 or 2 elders of the faction come over. Wouldn't they be dealt with quickly and easily? Even if they were recognized, what could they do? He was already his prisoner. What else could he do? However, his lord had always been cautious. He'd better act according to the plan. Anyway, the current situation was still under his control. As long as he captured the leader, he could go back and report. Thinking about this, the old man in black looked at the tent that He Tianshu and the others came out of. There were still a few female disciples guarding it, blocking the entry of the black-clothed people. Just as the old man in black was thinking about Yin, there were some changes on He Tianshu's side. He Tianshu stared at the black-clothed person for a while. Suddenly, he felt that the swordsmanship was somewhat familiar. After thinking carefully, he suddenly shouted, You're the second master of the robbery path a few days ago? You actually used a saber to perform swordsmanship. No wonder I felt that the swordsmanship was familiar. The black-clothed person laughed and said, "Very good. The disciples of the Misty School are indeed extraordinary. You even recognize me like this. I used a saber to fight you to a draw. Today, I'll let you see my true power." After saying that, the swordsmanship changed again. It was fast and strange. In the night, He Tianshu was not careful and was stabbed in the right arm. Fortunately, he saw it quickly and quickly withdrew his sword to protect himself. Only then did he suffer a light injury. Even so, the blood flowed down his arm and dripped to the ground with the rain. He Tianshu saw that the situation was not good. He did not dare to hide anymore. He raised the tip of his sword and performed the secret swordsmanship of the Misty School disciples. One move after another, he fought with the black-clothed person again. Since the one who fought with He Tianshu was the second master, then the one who fought with the stone ox must be the first master. Unfortunately, the first master used a chi-mei stick today. His moves were completely different. Although his figure did not change, how could the stone ox recognize him? The stone ox was too lazy to think about it, even if the first master was still using a saber. The question of, how come the person who was beaten by me to vomit blood is standing in front of me now? Is his martial arts even better than that day? How could it be compared to smashing someone to death with a fist? Although the first master had considered the stone ox's martial arts, he had still underestimated it. Now it seemed that he had been at a disadvantage and could only hold on. However, his task was only to prevent the stone ox from being distracted. Wasn't the black-clothed old man, who was more powerful than the stone ox, still on the horse? Yes, the old man in black was still sitting on the horse and did not make any movements. At this time, the people of the Huanxi Manor were like a piece of meat on the chopping board. They were being pulled by the black-clothed person's saber bit by bit. They were only waiting for the final moment when the butcher's saber slid down. There was some ridicule in the eyes of the old man in black, as if he was playing a game of cat and mouse. He seemed to be able to hear the moans of the opponent in his ears. He enjoyed it very much. At this time, the fighting in the field had reached its climax. From time to time, there were screams. Perhaps it was the black-clothed person or the people of the manor. However, except for the old man in black and Zhang Xiaohua, who was hiding in the shadow of the tent, the others probably had no time to care about it. In such a dark night, as long as they could save their own lives, it was more important than anything else. And our poor Zhang Xiaohua really did not know what to do at this time. In his 13-year life journey, he had experienced the fight in Luzhin and the fight with the bandits of Shizue Mountain on the way back to the Guozhuang house from 8 Mile Ditch. Although he was also a participant in these two fights, he played the role of a guinea pig from the beginning. Because he did not have any martial strength, he was knocked down with one kick. Now that he had a trace of power to protect himself, he was eager to have a try. On the other hand, Luzhin's encounter was not life-threatening. Although the fight in Shizue Mountain was very bloody, Lu Yuemin controlled it very well. Zhang Xiaohua did not feel that his life was in danger. However, today was different. There were continuous fights in the field. From time to time, people were injured and lost their lives. In the eyes of Zhang Xiaohua, this cruel scene gave rise to a deep sense of oppression. It made Zhang Xiaohua a little breathless. It made Zhang Xiaohua only want to escape from the scene. Moreover, didn't He Tianshu also tell him to find a chance to run away when the situation became chaotic? But what about Sister O and Sister Qiu Tong? For a moment, Zhang Xiaohua was in a dilemma. However, he had forgotten that if he stayed, he would not be of any help. He was only standing on the side of his conscience and ignoring his own abilities. However, fortunately, for the time being, the black-robed men and the disciples of Huanxi Mountain Villa were in a state of balance. Although many people on both sides had lost their fighting capacity, they were still evenly matched. The black-robed men did not have extra people in the tent, so Zhang Xiaohua was still safe. There were 7 or 8 tents in the camp of Huanxi Mountain Villa. They were all set up around O Yan's tent in the middle. Zhang Xiaohua's tent was on one side. Just as Zhang Xiaohua hesitated for a moment, suddenly, he saw a sword light flashing behind O Yan's tent. The tent was cut open and several people came out. Because of the darkness, he could not see clearly, but they must be O Yan's group. Zhang Xiaohua was overjoyed. He moved and was about to run over there. However, At this moment, the black-clothed old man who was sitting on the horse moved his eyes. He exerted strength in his legs and stepped on the horse's back. His arms shook, and he flew off from the horse's back like a big bird. He flew straight towards the tent in the middle. After a few leaps, he arrived in front of the tent. "Please collect it, thank you." 0. Chapter 126. Although Shernyo, Aunt Qin, He Tianshu, and the others were fighting with their lives on the line, some of their attention was focused on the old man in black. Now that they saw the old man fly into the camp, their hearts tightened and their moves became even fiercer. They wanted to quickly retreat and block the old man, but how could their opponents let them do as they wished? They also used all of their strength and attacked even harder. Even Shernyo's opponent, who was at a disadvantage before, quickly changed his moves when he saw the old man attack. His inner strength also became fiercer, causing Shernyo to be flustered and lose the upper hand. For a moment, he couldn't escape. Presumably, this was the old man in black's wishful thinking. The old man in black arrived in front of the tent, but he didn't directly enter. Instead, he slowly walked to the back of the tent, as if he already knew that the people inside had broken through the tent and escaped from the back. Yin and Xiao Tong, under the cover of a few female disciples, came out of the tent. They had just taken a few steps when they saw the old man stride towards them. They couldn't help but cover their mouths and almost cry out in shock. The female disciple named Chang'e pointed at the tent next to Zhang Xiaohua's and decisively said to Yin, "Manor Lord, the horse is in the tent in front. You and Xiao Tong go over there. We'll go and block this old thief." After speaking, she waved her hand and the female disciples ran over from Yin's side. They held long swords and stood between the old man in black and Yin. Yin looked at the backs of Chang'e and the others. She opened her mouth to say something, but nothing came out. She only bit her lip and quickly walked towards the tent. When the old man saw Chang'e and the others blocking in front of him, he couldn't help but laugh sinisterly. "You girls want to be mantises trying to stop a chariot? Why don't you throw down your long swords and this old man will let you live? I only want to capture this guy. I'm not interested in the others." Chang'e and the others didn't reply. When they saw the old man walk closer, they pointed their long swords and several people stabbed at the old man from different angles. But unexpectedly, the old man didn't fight back. He just kept walking forward, allowing the swords to pierce his body. Chang'e and the others were delighted, but then they were shocked. The old man must have something to rely on. Could these murderous swords still work? Sure enough, as the old man did not stop, the long sword stabbed into his body. Chang'e and the others felt that they were not stabbing into a person's flesh, but rather, they felt as if they were stabbing into an iron plate. It was hard, and there was a faint ding-dang sound. The long sword immediately bent under everyone's inner strength. The old man was very satisfied with this result. Heh. He shook his arms and used his strength to hit the curved long swords. Kacha. A few of the long swords actually broke from the middle. Moreover, the inner strength in the swords was not exhausted and rushed towards the female disciples' arms. The female disciples were all hit by a heavy object and fell backwards. One of them even vomited blood and fell to the ground. After the other disciples fell to the ground, they immediately jumped up. Their faces were pale, and they held the broken swords in their hands. They couldn't stand steadily. Chang'e's situation was slightly better. Her long sword was not broken. She only stabilized her body and immediately rushed towards the old man. At this time, the old man was already walking towards Yin. His back was empty, so he rushed towards Chang'e. Chang'e's long sword stabbed towards the old man. However, with such a big back, Chang'e didn't dare to try again. She only used all the strength in her body and stabbed towards the back of the old man's neck. As early as when Chang'e and the other female disciples blocked the old man in black, Xiao Tong supported Yin and ran towards the hidden horse tent. However, the rain was still heavy and the ground was already very muddy. The ground by the river was uneven, and now it was full of water. How could they see it? They accidentally stepped into a small puddle. When they picked up their feet, they didn't even know where their shoes had gone. But how could they care about that? They just blindly ran forward. Unfortunately, How could two weak women who had never practiced martial arts run far in such a short period of time? Yin and Xiu Tong were only halfway there when Changa's sword stabbed the back of the black-clothed old man's neck. At this time, Yan's feet sank as if she had stepped into a deep pit. Her right leg sank halfway into the pit, and her body instantly lost balance and fell to the right. Xiu Tong, who was supporting Yin, was also caught off guard. She used all her strength to pull on Yan's arm, but not only did she fail to support Yin, but she also staggered and fell forward. At this time, a cry of surprise came from another tent. Sister Sister Xiu Tong? A small figure ran from afar and ran towards Yin and Xiu Tong, who had fallen to the ground. Wasn't that Zhang Xiaohua who was hiding in the tent? In fact, when he saw Yin and Xiu Tong come out of the tent, Zhang Xiaohua wanted to run over. But before he could get up, the old man in black used his qinggong. Zhang Xiaohua's martial arts were not good, but his senses were sharp and he quickly stopped. Chang'e and the others attacked the old man in black. Zhang Xiaohua also saw it clearly and his heart turned cold. But when he saw Yin and Xiu Tong fall, he couldn't hold it in anymore. He shouted and ran out, wanting to support them to prevent them from falling on the muddy ground. However, Zhang Xiaohua didn't know qinggong. Before he could run out of the tent, Yin and Xiu Tong each fell to the muddy ground with a plop. Their clothes were already soaked and their faces were smeared with black mud. After Yin fell to the ground, she struggled to stand up, but it seemed that she fell too hard and for a moment, she couldn't get up. Although Xiu Tong was covered in mud, she didn't dare to delay and quickly struggled to stand up. As for the sword-wielding Chang'e, when Yin stepped into the mud, she circulated the qi in her dantian and injected all her strength into the longsword. Steadily, accurately, and viciously, she stabbed it into the back of the black-clothed elder's neck. The black-clothed elder seemed to have eyes on the back of his head. When the long sword filled with inner strength was about to pierce his neck, he suddenly turned around and stared at the tip of the sword that was approaching him. With a ding sound, the long sword stabbed into his palm. It was like stabbing into metal, and sparks almost appeared. Then, the black-clothed elder clenched his fist and grasped the tip of the long sword in his hand. With a little bit of strength, he broke the tip of the sword with a kacha sound. Then, he waved his hand and the tip of the sword shot towards Chang'e's chest like an arrow. Chang'e was shocked and quickly swung her sword to block it. But it was too late. Chang'e barely managed to tilt her body and dodge the tip of the sword. Unfortunately, the tip of the sword was too fast. Just as Chang'e's body moved, the tip of the sword was in front of her eyes. She only had time to dodge the tip of the sword. With a plop sound, the tip of the sword pierced deeply into Chang'e's left shoulder. A sharp pain came and Chang'e couldn't help but let out a low growl. The powerful force in the tip of the sword actually caused the injured Chang'e to lose her balance. She took a few steps back and with a plop sound, she also fell onto the muddy ground. Blood gushed out of her shoulder like a fountain, and Chang'e fainted for a moment. The black-clothed elder stood there without moving. When he saw that Chang'e had fainted, he then walked towards Yin. At this time, Zhang Xiaohua had already rushed to Yin's side and was reaching out to help Yin up from the mud. The black-clothed elder walked slowly, looking at everything in front of him with ridicule. He had already noticed when Zhang Xiaohua rushed out of the tent. However, he saw that Zhang Xiaohua's steps were clumsy and heavy and didn't even know the basics of lightness skills. Looking at his small figure, he was basically a child who had just started to develop. He only treated him as a manservant in Huanqi manner and naturally didn't take him seriously. He could deal with a disciple of the Misty school like Chang'e with a wave of his hand, not to mention a child. Perhaps he could take Zhang Xiaohua's life with just a finger. When Zhang Xiaohua helped Yin up from the mud, Xiu Tong also got up from the ground. When the two of them pulled Yin forward, one on the left and one on the right, they found that Yin's right foot was injured and couldn't touch the ground. It must be because of this that Yin couldn't stand up just now. Thus, Zhang Xiaohua placed Yin's right hand on his shoulder. He took a step forward and squatted slightly. His left hand took Yin's left hand from Xiu Tong's and placed it on his shoulder. Xiu Tong was stunned and immediately understood. She quickly helped Zhang Xiaohua place Yin on his back. Zhang Xiaohua's body had just started to develop, and he was still half a head shorter than Yan. His thin and weak body looked a little thin on Yan's back. Fortunately, Zhang Xiaohua's arms were strong, and it wasn't very difficult. By the time Qiu Tong placed Yan on Zhang Xiaohua's back, the old man in black had already walked up to them. When Zhang Xiaohua saw this, he ran as if he was weightless. However, he didn't run towards the tent, but the small river by the side. Qiu Tong followed behind him. The old man in black watched Zhang Xiaohua and Qiu Tong's movements as if he was watching a play. He didn't disturb them and only frowned when Zhang Xiaohua ran towards the small river. He didn't care if Yan and the others ran towards the tent on horseback. With his qinggong, even if Yan was riding a horse, he was confident that he could catch up to her. However, in the current river, due to the rising water level, the riverbed was faster and the water was more turbulent. If Zhang Xiaohua jumped into the water, it would be like a cooked duck flying away. This was something the old man in black would never allow. Just as the old man in black was about to use his qinggong to catch up, suddenly, a tall man in black riding a horse arrived at the scene. Then, a loud voice rang out, "Brothers, there are more than 10 fast horses coming from the distance. They are probably reinforcements from the Misty School. Let's cut the Gordian knot quickly." This abnormally loud voice was very familiar to the people in Huanxi Manor. Soon, everyone remembered. Wasn't this the bandit who first appeared in the farce in the forest that day? It wasn't clear whether this guy was reminding his accomplices or encouraging the people in Huanxi Manor. Anyway, after this voice rang out, the people in Huanxi Manor immediately became energetic. On the other hand, the men in black seemed to be a little defeated. The balance that had been maintained for a long time was broken by this guy's voice. However, this instigator didn't have any sense of shame. He clapped his hands, turned his horse around, and rode in the direction he came from. It wasn't clear whether he would continue to explore or escape. The playful look in the old man's eyes immediately disappeared. He thought to himself, "In that case, oh girl, don't blame me for being ruthless." Thinking of this, he immediately quickened his pace and used his qinggong to chase after Zhang Xiaohua, who was running in front of him. Not long after, he caught up with Qiu Tong. Seeing that he was about to catch up with Yan, the old man in black didn't increase his speed to pass by Zhang Xiaohua to block his path. Instead, he maintained his speed and secretly circulated his qi. His hands immediately turned pale gold. At this time, Qiu Tong, who was beside him, saw the strange behavior of the old man in black and immediately shouted, "Xiaohua, behind you." Zhang Xiaohua, who was running, was still very sensitive. She had already sensed that something was wrong behind her. When Qiu Tong reminded her, she immediately stopped. At this time, the foundation of her martial arts was revealed. She stood steadily and turned around. However, the old man in black didn't stop. He continued to rush toward Zhang Xiaohua and Yan. His pale gold palm seemed to be about to swing out. Seeing this, Zhang Xiaohua didn't have time to put Yan on the ground. She just let go of her hands. She didn't care if Yan was standing on the ground or not. She exerted force with her right leg and rushed toward the old man in black. Yan and Qiu Tong both knew how good Zhang Xiaohua's martial arts were. He hadn't even learned a single set of martial arts. He hadn't even learned a single word about the inner strength cultivation method. If he rushed forward like this, it was no different from feeding the tiger with his own body. He was only trying to buy some time for Yan. Yan and Qiu Tong both shouted, "Zhang Xiaohua." They actually sounded like they were about to cry. Actually, when Zhang Xiaohua was running with Yan on her back, she had already thought about it. Although Yan was the manor lord of Huanxi Manor, she usually treated her very well. She had taken good care of him during his time in the manor, just like how Lu Qin cared about him in the past. Not only did she allow He Tianshu to teach him martial arts, she also allowed him to read her treasured books. She even allowed Opong to teach him the inner strength cultivation method. He couldn't repay her for all of these. In this situation, whether it was Lu Qin, Qiu Tong, or Yan, he would stand in front of them without hesitation, even if there was a bottomless abyss in front of him. When Zhang Xiaohua rushed towards the black-clothed old man, he didn't blindly use his body to block the attack. His left hand skillfully took out the toy-like small sword from his chest. His left arm naturally displayed the fifth variation of the sword move that Elder Yu had taught him. A warm current flowed from his left arm and slowly moved forward along his left arm. The small sword also slowly pierced towards the black-clothed old man's throat. The black-clothed old man wasn't surprised to see Zhang Xiaohua turn around. He was somewhat surprised that Zhang Xiaohua had left Yin behind and rushed towards him. However, there was only a trace of mockery on his face. There were many people in this world who had lost their lives for justice. Today, there would be one more. This young man didn't have any martial arts at all. Against him, it was tantamount to a moth flying into a flame. When he saw Zhang Xiaohua take out a toy from his chest, the smile in his eyes became even brighter. How could this kind of child's toy hurt him? He originally wanted to ignore it and let it stab into his body. How could his iron cloth skill, which he had painstakingly trained for decades, be weak? However, he saw this young man stab his sword very steadily. Although the sword was very slow, the angle and timing were very good. The direction of the sword was also his throat. For the sake of caution, the black-clothed old man still raised his left hand and blocked in front of his throat. He was prepared to snatch Zhang Xiaohua's toy, just like he had grabbed Chang'e's long sword. At the same time, the black-clothed old man's figure didn't stop. Instead, he continued to move forward. His right palm turned towards Yin, who was beside Zhang Xiaohua. His goal at this time was no longer to capture Yin. Instead, he wanted to kill her under his pale golden palm. Yin and Xiu Tong had just finished shouting when they saw the black-clothed old man's palm. They immediately understood his intentions and couldn't help but turn pale. Even Chang'e and the other female disciples couldn't stop this Jianghu expert. How could Zhang Xiaohua be his opponent? How could they escape from his evil clutches? Just as they were thinking, Zhang Xiaohua's small edgeless sword had already hit the black-clothed old man's palm. That warm current just happened to flow into the small sword at this time. The sword and palm collided, but there wasn't a dang sound like Chang'e's long sword. It also wasn't as the black-clothed old man imagined that Zhang Xiaohua would be sent flying on the spot. Instead, there was a poochie sound, the sound of flesh being pierced. That small edgeless sword actually pierced through the palm filled with internal energy. Moreover, its momentum didn't decrease. The black-clothed old man's heart was greatly shocked. How could he still care about hitting Yin with his pale golden palm? When the palm was halfway through, it immediately changed direction and hit Zhang Xiaohua's chest. At the same time, he immediately circulated his internal energy to his throat, only to make his throat as hard as a real piece of iron. He waited for the small sword to be deflected with a dang sound. However, something strange happened. Zhang Xiaohua's sword pierced the black-clothed old man's throat. It only paused for a moment. Immediately, like piercing through tofu, there wasn't the slightest bit of resistance as it entered the black-clothed old man's throat. The black-clothed old man was horrified as if he had seen a ghost. His eyes widened and his mouth opened. He couldn't say anything. At this time, his right palm had already struck Zhang Xiaohua's chest. However, following the piercing of Zhang Xiaohua's small sword, the strength in his palm had already lost 40% of its strength. However, how could Zhang Xiaohua withstand just 60% of his strength? Zhang Xiaohua flew out diagonally from the black-clothed old man's palm. She had already fainted in the air. She didn't have time to spit out the blood in her mouth. Even Yin, who was beside her, was affected. She spat out blood from the impact of the black-clothed old man's palm and fell to the ground dispiritedly. As for the black-clothed old man, it was even worse. When his right palm sent Zhang Xiaohua flying, the small sword in his throat was immediately pulled out. Not much blood flowed out from his throat, only a bit of red. However, this bit of red was already enough to take the black-clothed old man's life. His bleeding left hand clutched his throat as he looked in disbelief at Zhang Xiaohua, who was sent flying in the air. His legs went weak and he fell to the ground. Before he died, his eyes were still open. He really died with a grievance. One sword. Just one sword. Zhang Xiaohua killed this nearly invincible black-clothed old man on the spot. 0. Chapter 127. When the black-clothed old man flew into the camp using his qinggong, Shernyo, Aunt Qin, and He Tianshu wanted to break away from their opponents and go back to help Yin. However, the black-clothed man had already figured out their situation. These 3 black-clothed men were specially sent to deal with the 3 people from the Misty School. Their martial arts were also extraordinary. In a hurry, they couldn't get rid of them. However, while everyone was fighting for their lives, they were also anxiously watching the situation at Yan's side. Chang'e and the other female disciples' resistance, as well as Zhang Xiaohua's appearance, were all seen by the 3 people. However, the black-clothed old man's super-strong internal energy and terrifying iron shirt martial arts. Even if Shernyo himself went up, he might not be able to gain an advantage. Therefore, the 3 people, including the disciples of the villa, were all disheartened. They were afraid that today, these people from the villa would be buried here. However, in the end, there was a major change in the situation. The Misty School actually had reinforcements, especially Bandit Jia's loud voice. It reignited the desire to live in Huanxi Villa. The more they fought, the braver they became. On the contrary, the black-clothed men changed their strategy. They fought while retreating, approaching the horses outside the camp. The 3 black-clothed men who were fighting Shernyo and the others also had the intention to retreat. When the black-clothed old man used his qinggong to chase after Zhang Xiaohua, they all fainted and left the circle, leaping towards the horses. At this time, if Shernyo and the others wanted to keep these 3 people, it wouldn't be difficult. However, the 3 main forces of the Misty School weren't people who were fond of fighting. Their mission was to protect Yin. Seeing their opponents retreat, they didn't chase after them and immediately used their qinggong to fly towards the black-clothed old man. In their minds, the black-clothed old man didn't immediately make a move at first. Instead, he used his qinggong to exhaust their fighting strength. His goal was to capture Yin alive. Although they were far away from Yin and definitely wouldn't be able to save her in time, if the 3 of them attacked the black-clothed old man together, they might be able to take Yin back. Moreover, the reinforcements would be arriving soon. Perhaps it would be an elder from the school. This was Aunt Qin and the rest's wishful thinking. However, when they were still halfway there, they heard Xiao Tong's shout. Only then did they notice the black-robed elder's pale golden palm. The 3 of them were greatly alarmed. How was this elder going to capture Yin alive? He was clearly going to take her life. Thus, the 3's footsteps quickened. However, how could they cross such a distance in an instant? They could only helplessly watch as a tragedy unfolded. However, they had guessed the beginning of the story, but not the end. Until the black-clothed with Xiao Tong, they didn't know what had happened. They didn't know what had happened. They didn't understand. But they didn't know, they worse with O. By the time the 3 arrived at the scene, everything was over. Aunt Qin rushed forward to check on Yan's injuries with Xiao Tong. Shernyo carefully walked in front of the black-clothed old man. He looked at his corpse from afar to confirm whether he was really dead. He Tianshu, on the other hand, looked in the direction Zhang Xiaohua had been sent flying to find Zhang Xiaohua. At this time, the group of black-clothed men who were still alive had already returned to their horses. They all mounted their horses. The people from Huanxi Manor didn't chase after them. They only held their weapons and stood in front of the campsite. The rain continued to fall. The sound of the rain couldn't cover the sound of horse hooves approaching. The 3 leaders who disguised themselves as robbers had all seen the black-clothed old man die. Although they didn't know what had happened, it was a fact that he was dead. It was very unrealistic for them to take Yan's life with just the few of them, not to mention the Misty School's reinforcements that were about to arrive. Thus, the first leader thought for a moment. He waved his hand and gestured. He took the lead and galloped in another direction. The remaining black-clothed men ignored the corpses in the campsite and followed him. The people who were standing outside the campsite with swords and sabers couldn't help but cheer when they saw the black-clothed men leave. There were even a few people who relaxed and fell to the ground, throwing their swords and sabers to the side. At the same time, the sound of horse hooves in the distance finally came closer. The person on the horse saw the tent in the campsite and quickly shouted, "Are you the brothers from the Misty School? Wasn't that the voice of Lan Dong, who they saw a few days ago?" A disciple who recognized Lan Dong also quickly responded, "Brother Lan, you're finally here. It's us." When Lan Dong heard the response, half of the stone in his heart was lifted. He swung the stirrups and dismounted. Seeing the sorry state of the people, his heart tightened again. He quickly asked, "Where is Manor Lord O?" Everyone pointed to O Yan's location. Lan Dong immediately rushed over, ignoring the mud on the ground. When Lan Dong arrived, Aunt Chin had already taken O Yan's pulse. Lan Dong saw that O Yan's eyes were closed and her face was pale. He anxiously asked, "How is Manor Lord's injury?" Aunt Chin frowned and said, "Her life should be fine. It's just that Manor Lord's body is weak to begin with. Now that she was injured by that old thief, her internal injuries are not light. She will need a long time to recover." Hearing this, Lan Dong's uneasy heart finally settled back into his stomach. At this time, the stone cow also walked over. Aunt Chin asked doubtfully, "Is that old thief dead?" The corner of the stone cow's mouth curled up. He said, "Yes, he's dead. A sword pierced through his throat. He couldn't be more dead. Yes, he died with his eyes wide open." Then he asked, "How is Manor Lord?" Aunt Chin smiled and said, "It's all thanks to Zhang Xiaohua blocking the palm for Manor Lord. The last palm was also aimed at Zhang Xiaohua. Manor Lord was only affected by it. It's no big deal. She'll probably wake up tomorrow." The stone cow was surprised. "She'll only wake up tomorrow? This isn't serious?" Aunt Chin said, "Isn't this much better than what we expected?" The stone cow also nodded and said, "That's right. It's all thanks to Zhang Xiaohua." Zhang Xiaohua? Lan Dong was puzzled. How come he had never heard of this name? From the sound of it, her martial arts must be very strong. However, there didn't seem to be this name among the martial uncles. Could it be an elder of the sect? Could it be that the elder had already arrived before him? That was impossible. He had rushed here from the town without stopping to rest. How could that elder fly here? Just as Lan Dong was surprised, He Tianshu dragged his heavy steps out of the darkness and rushed over. As he ran, he shouted, "Zhang Xiaohua is missing. She probably fell into the river. Quickly find a brother who knows how to swim and look for her in the river." "What? Zhang Xiaohua fell into the river?" Aunt Chin, the stone cow, and Qiu Tong all cried out in alarm. O Yin was already seriously injured after being hit by the black-clothed elder's palm. That Zhang Xiaohua was hit in the chest by the pale golden palm. What kind of injury was that? With this kind of injury and falling into the rushing river, Zhang Xiaohua, could he still? Thinking of this, no one dared to think any further. Aunt Chin quickly said, "Shernyo, find a brother who knows how to swim and quickly search the surroundings. Lan Dong, send a group of accompanying brothers to ride along the river. See if there's anything along the way or in the river." Shernyo and Lan Dong received the order and stood up. However, Lan Dong only took 2 steps before turning back and asking, "Hallmaster Chin, what does this Zhang Xiaohua look like?" Only then did Aunt Chin remember. How did Lan Dong know about Zhang Xiaohua? She quickly said apologetically, "She's just a 12 or 13-year-old child. She's seriously injured. You'll know once you see her." 12 or 13-year-old child? Lan Dong felt a wave of dizziness and wondered if Aunt Chin was wrong. Eldest sister Chin saw that Lan Dong was stunned and frowned. "She's just a teenager. Why aren't you going to look for her?" "Oh, okay. We'll send people." Lan Dong seemed to wake up from a dream and quickly got up to assign people. Only then did Aunt Chin and Qiu Tong carefully carry the unconscious O Yin back to the tent. The heavy rain poured down and the night was as dark as ink. Between heaven and earth, there was endless darkness. It was already past midnight, but Huanxi Manor's camp was still noisy. They had just been attacked, and no one could guarantee that the enemy wouldn't come back again. Lan Dong only brought a dozen or so disciples, and they were all ordinary disciples with average martial arts skills. The black-clothed men had hurriedly retreated because Lan Dong's arrival had broken their advantage in strength. They didn't know how many people the Misty School had. More importantly, the black-clothed old man who was in charge of the situation was the most likely person to capture O Yin. However, he was killed by an inconspicuous youth. This disrupted the plan they had been planning for many days, and they had no choice but to retreat. If they had figured out the Misty School's current strength, they might not have returned immediately. Therefore, other than the injured disciples who had returned to their tents to rest, the other disciples' hearts were still beating fast, and they were on high alert. Although Huanxi Manor's camp was near the river and it was already very unsafe, in this dark night, the enemy might still be spying on them. Many factors determined that they couldn't move rashly for the time being. They could only wait for the sky to brighten before making any plans. For the same reason, there weren't many disciples who went to look for Zhang Xiaohua. In fact, all the disciples in the camp already knew what had just happened. They also knew that Zhang Xiaohua had not only saved Yin, but also everyone in the camp. The black-clothed old man's martial arts skills were obvious to all. Even if Lan Dong and the rest came to the rescue in time, the dozen or so of them were far from being a match for the black-clothed old man. Everyone's fate was inevitably the same as Yan's, and they were all killed by the old man's palm. They knew that Zhang Xiaohua was hit in the chest by the black-clothed old man's pale golden palm, and they already knew that he was most likely killed on the spot. Even if he still had a breath left, his severely injured body was swept into the river, and even if there was only a little bit of life left, it would be extinguished. They were also willing to go to the river and follow the river to look for Zhang Xiaohua. However, the river was turbulent, and they didn't know where he had been washed away. Moreover, the sky was dark and it was raining heavily. The torches were extinguished, so where could they find the light to look for him? Although He Tianchu's men and those who rowed down the river were anxious, they also knew that they were doing their best and leaving the rest to fate. At the beginning, He Tianchu still shouted a few times with a loud voice, and several disciples also followed suit. But suddenly, He Tianchu seemed to have realized something, and he shut his mouth and stopped shouting. At the same time, he also stopped the others from shouting. The disciples were very puzzled at first and wanted to ask the reason, but when they saw He Tianchu's tense face, they didn't dare to ask more. After thinking about it carefully, they couldn't help but secretly admire He Tianchu. He was really worthy of being a captain. When they shouted like this, didn't they let the black-robed men know their whereabouts? Captain, he was really meticulous. He Tianchu didn't know that his position in the hearts of others had suddenly risen by a lot. He only thought about it blindly. Sigh, it's already past midnight. The disciples who went down the river to look for Zhang Xiaohua couldn't see far in the dark. Moreover, the safety of the campsite was more important. Therefore, they soon returned. When He Tianchu saw that they had returned, he stopped searching and called for those who were searching in the river and nearby to return to the campsite together. His heart was filled with sadness. When He Tianchu returned to the tent in the center of the campsite, Aunt Qin and Qiu Tong hurriedly came up to him with eager faces. They asked, "Did you find him?" He Tianchu shook his head silently. Qiu Tong's tears flowed down with a whoosh. She gritted her teeth tightly. Aunt Qin also muttered, "Poor child." Everyone was silent. After a while, He Tianchu asked, "Is the village lord all right?" Aunt Qin nodded and said, "He's all right. There aren't any changes. We can only know the specific situation when the doctor sees him tomorrow morning." He Tianchu said, "It's Zhang Xiaohua's wish that the village lord is fine. I'll go stand guard outside first. If the black-clothed man comes back, it'll be troublesome." He Tianchu was about to leave when the stone cow came in from outside. Seeing He Tianchu, he asked, "You still haven't found him?" He Tianchu said, "No." The stone cow sighed and turned to Aunt Qin. "I've already checked that old thief." Aunt Qin and He Tianchu's eyes lit up. They asked in unison, "Who is it?" The stone cow shook his head and said, "This person has old injuries on his face. His face has long been disfigured. I can't tell who he is. The light golden palm and iron shirt aren't high-level martial arts. There are at least 100 people in Jianghu who have reached his level. It's not easy to find him." Aunt Qin nodded and said, "What about the other corpses? Did you find any clues?" The stone cow shook his head again and said, "These people have all gone through strict training. They all wore ordinary night clothes and didn't carry anything. Their weapons were also common in Jianghu. It's hard to find anything." Aunt Qin thought for a moment and said, "No matter. Keep these corpses and weapons well, and bring them back to Misty Mountain Villa. If we can't identify them, the experts in the sect will do it. Leave this matter to them." The stone cow agreed and was about to leave. At this moment, Aunt Qin called out to him and asked, "How did that old thief die?" Hearing this question, He Tianshu looked at the stone cow anxiously, wanting to know the answer. The stone cow's expression was strange and said, "There were 2 wounds on that old thief's body. One was his left palm, which seemed to have been pierced by something. The other was his throat, which seemed to have been pierced by a sword. I don't know how Zhang Xiaohua did it. At that time, the sky was dark and I couldn't see clearly. What about you?" Aunt Qin shook her head. What a joke. The sky was so dark and it was raining. Although one could see things in the dark when one's internal energy was strong, she hadn't reached that level yet. When the stone cow heard this, he smiled bitterly and said, "Then it can only be a mystery. This Zhang Xiaohua probably didn't have much luck." Alas, this fellow was frank and outspoken. His words made everyone feel sad. At this moment, He Tianshu suddenly asked, "Brother Sure, were the wounds on that old thief's hand similar to those of a long sword, just narrower than a normal long sword?" The stone cow was stunned and didn't understand why he asked this. He nodded and said, "Yes." He Tianshu's eyes lit up and asked again, "Then, were the wounds on his throat also smaller than those of a normal long sword?" The stone cow seemed to understand this point and said, "Yes, brother He, you're right." "Then what kind of weapon did these old thieves use to kill them?" He Tianshu smiled bitterly and told them about the toy sword that Zhang Xiaohua was given to him when he bought the long sword. It was fine if he didn't talk about it, but after he talked about it, everyone was even more confused. That toy sword had no tip, so how could it pierce through the old man's throat? How could it pierce through the old man's palm? Don't forget, the old man practiced the light golden palm and the iron shirt. Even the sword of a female disciple like Chang'e couldn't pierce through the old man's body. How did Zhang Xiaohua do it? This was really a mystery. The sky finally brightened, but the rain didn't show any signs of stopping. Under the watchful eyes of the Misty School's disciples, the black-clothed man didn't return. Everyone couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief. That unbearable and unforgettable night was finally over. Yin was still unconscious, but judging from her pulse, it was still very stable. This was considered a blessing in disguise. Since the village head was unconscious, Aunt Qin was naturally in charge of everything. They couldn't stay in this campsite any longer, and with Yan's condition, it was probably impossible for them to go south. Moreover, there were still unknown black-clothed men hiding nearby. Even if Yin was fine, Peng, who was far away in Pingyang City, would definitely not agree to let Yin go there again. Hence, when the sky was slightly brighter, Aunt Qin gave the order to pack up the campsite and return quickly. Naturally, they couldn't take the old route on the way back. Aunt Qin followed Lan Dong's instructions and went on the nearby official road. She redrew the route back to Pingyang City. She would rather take a long detour than take the small roads. She would rather travel slowly and stay in a town for the night. Furthermore, Lan Dong quickly reported the robbery to the higher-ups and requested for more people to come and assist them. When Yin woke up, it was already afternoon. The first thing she did when she woke up was to ask about Zhang Xiaohua's situation. After listening to Aunt Qin's explanation, she felt dejected. Everyone's decision wasn't wrong, and it wasn't realistic to send people to look for him now. It would be better to wait until they met up with the people from the Misty School. As for Aunt Qin's decision to return to Pingyang City, Yin didn't have much objection. Peng originally didn't agree to her coming out this time. She had coaxed and pestered him to let her go. She thought that she was just a village head and didn't have any grudges in the pugilistic world. What danger could she possibly be in? However, the cruel reality told her that humans were harmless, but tigers hurt people. Anyone who survived in the pugilistic world couldn't forget this cruel rule at any time. However, no matter how hard Yin racked her brains, she couldn't remember who exactly she had offended. Please add it to your collection. Thank you. 0. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.